The hospital corridor on the third floor of St. Margaret's smelled like floor wax and cold coffee at 2 in the morning on the 17th of October, 2025. Florence Quintrell could hear it in fragments. The squeak of a nurse's shoes on linoleum, the distant whir of an ice machine, the small urgent breathing of the newborn pressed against her collarbone. Wren had been alive for 6 hours and 40 minutes. The clock above the door confirmed it in red numerals that pulsed faintly each time the second hand passed. Florence kept counting because counting was a thing she could still do. She could not stand. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She could not stop the slow leak of warmth between her legs without help from the woman in mint scrubs who came every 20 minutes to press her abdomen and write something on a chart. She could not call anyone because the only number she had memorized was Desmond's, and Desmond had not answered any of the 11 times the nurse had tried him before the contractions began coming 3 minutes apart. He had been at the house when she went into labor. He had driven her to the emergency entrance. He had kissed her forehead at the admission desk and said he was going back for her overnight bag and the car seat. That had been at 6 in the evening. It was now 2 in the morning. He had not come back. The first time Florence asked the nurse what time it was, the nurse pretended not to hear her. The second time, the nurse said in the careful voice people use with bad news that maybe she should rest. The third time, Florence stopped asking, because she understood by then what the careful voice meant. It meant that the staff had already begun making private guesses about what kind of man left a woman in delivery and stopped answering his phone. It meant they had probably seen this before. It meant they had a script for it. Florence pressed her face against the top of Wren's head and breathed in the scent that babies have for the first few days of their lives, that warm, yeasty animal smell that does not belong to any other thing on earth. Her daughter weighed 7 pounds, 2 ounces. She had been 24 minutes in the actual pushing. The midwife had said she was efficient. Florence remembered laughing at that word through the haze of the epidural. Efficient. By the time the sun came up over the parking garage across the way, painting the curtains a thin, watery pink, Florence had stopped expecting the door to open. The morning shift came in. A young aide brought her a tray of scrambled eggs and a packet of orange juice with a foil top. Wren slept against her chest in the wrap the lactation consultant had shown her how to tie. Florence ate the eggs because Wren would need her to. She drank the juice because the discharge nurse said her blood pressure was lower than they liked. She watched the door without seeming to watch it. The way you watch for something you have already accepted will not arrive. At 11 in the morning, a woman from social services knocked twice and came in without waiting. Her name tag said Olamide, and she had kind eyes and a clipboard. She asked Florence if there was someone she could call. Florence said her grandmother was dead. Her mother was dead. Her father had been gone since she was 9. Her best friend Imogen had moved to Reno 2 years before for a nursing job and didn't have a spare room. The husband, Olamide asked. Florence shook her head. The husband. Florence said the word the way you say the name of a town you no longer live in. Husband. The legal designation was still accurate. Desmond Halvorsen and Florence Quintrell had been married for 4 years and 8 months. They owned a house together on Brindle Lane in a town called Carthridge Hollow about 90 minutes north of the city, a small white 2-story with green shutters that she had been so proud of when they signed the papers that she had cried in the title agent's office. Olamide wrote something on her clipboard. She asked if Florence had keys. Florence said yes. Olamide asked if Florence had a ride. Florence said the car was at the house. The car was in his name. Olamide stopped writing for a moment. Then she said she could arrange a discharge taxi and a temporary food box and a referral to a family advocate who specialized in this. Florence said she wasn't sure what this was. Olamide said gently that they would figure it out together. The taxi dropped her at the foot of the driveway at 4 in the afternoon. The October light had turned that particular shade of yellow that only happens in the Hudson Valley in mid-fall, the kind that makes every brick look soft. The leaves on the maples lining Brindle Lane were already at peak, deep coppery reds, and a yellow, so bright it almost hurt to look at. Florence stood at the mailbox holding Wren in the new car seat that the hospital had given her for free because the social worker had quietly arranged it. The plastic bag with her discharge paperwork and a bottle of iron pills and a Perry bottle and 3 mesh underwear with thick pads tucked into them swung from her wrist. She walked up the driveway slowly because she could not walk any faster. Her body felt like it belonged to someone she did not know. The front door was locked, which was not strange. She took her keys out of her purse. The brass house key did not fit the lock. She tried it a second time, thinking maybe she had grabbed the back door key by mistake. But she had been opening this door for almost 5 years, and she knew the shape of the right key by touch alone, and the right key was the one in her hand, and it was not turning. She rang the doorbell. She rang it twice more. She walked around the side of the house through the gap between the garage and the hedge, the wet grass soaking through her thin canvas slip-ons, and tried the back door. The back door was also new. The lock was a brushed nickel where the old one had been brass. The deadbolt above it was a brand she did not recognize. There was a piece of paper taped to the inside of the small window in the door, written in marker in Desmond's blocky engineer's hand. The paper said, "Property of Desmond Halvorsen. Trespassers will be reported." Beneath that, in slightly smaller letters, it said, "Florence, your things are at storage facility 4B. Code 2244. She stood in the wet grass for a long time. Wren made a small noise inside the car seat that meant she would be hungry soon. The carrier was heavy. Florence's stitches were burning. She put one hand against the cedar siding to keep from sitting down right there in the mud. There is a kind of clarity that arrives sometimes when a person has stopped being able to feel anything else. Florence reached it standing in her own backyard looking at her own back door with a sign telling her she was a trespasser. Her thoughts went very quiet and very sharp. She lifted the car seat. She walked back down the driveway. She sat on the curb and called the only lawyer she could remember the name of, the woman who had handled their closing 5 years before, and she got a recording that said the office had moved. She called Olamide. Olamide picked up on the second ring. Olamide said, "Do not panic, and stay where you are, and I will come." By nightfall, Florence was in a Comfort Inn off the I-87 with a voucher from a women's shelter that did not have any beds available, and a pack and play borrowed from the front desk, and Wren rapped against her chest because Wren would not stop crying unless she could hear Florence's heartbeat. The room had a kitchenette with a microwave and a small refrigerator and a coffee maker that did not work. Florence sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and tried to understand what had happened. The marriage had been quiet for 6 months. Desmond had grown distant after they found out about the pregnancy, the way some men do, but Florence had read books about that and her aunt had said it was normal, and Desmond had still come to the 20-week scan and the birth class, and had bought a crib and assembled it with the wrong hardware twice before getting it right. Florence had thought distant meant scared. Distant had meant something else. The next morning, she called the storage facility. The man behind the desk had a name patch that said Ezekiel and a face that had stopped registering surprise about anything years ago. He led her to Unit 4B and waited while she punched in the code. The unit was the size of a small closet. Inside, neatly stacked along the back wall, were 11 cardboard boxes labeled in Desmond's handwriting. Clothes, books, bathroom, kitchen sundries, photos. Each box was sealed with packing tape, and the seams were perfectly aligned, because Desmond was a person who could not bring himself to do a thing badly, even when he was doing the worst possible version of it. He had packed her life for her. He had taped it shut. He had paid for 1 month of storage and then walked away. Florence sat down on the concrete floor with her back against the metal door and cried for the first time since the labor. Wren slept through it in the car seat beside her, eyelashes thick and dark against the new pink of her cheeks. After a while, Florence wiped her face on the inside of her cardigan and got up and started opening the boxes. She did not know what she was looking for. She found her clothes folded and her good kitchen knives in their wooden block and the photographs from her mother's side of the family in the wicker basket that had lived on top of the linen cabinet. She found her birth certificate and her social security card in a manila envelope she did not remember keeping. She found the framed picture of her grandmother Hazel that had hung in the upstairs hallway, the one of Hazel standing in front of a stone building in 1968, wearing a blue cotton dress with her hand on her hip and a half smile that looked like she was about to say something cutting. Florence held the picture for a long time. The glass had a hairline crack across the lower right corner. Desmond had not bothered to wrap it. What she did not find, after she had opened every box twice, was the deed. The deed to the house on Brindle Lane had been folded in the leather portfolio that Florence kept in the bottom drawer of her bedside table, along with the deed to her grandmother's old cottage that had been sold to settle the estate, and the mortgage paperwork, and the title to the Honda, and her marriage certificate. and a stack of older property documents she had inherited from her mother that she had never bothered to read. The leather portfolio was missing. The bedside table drawer would now belong to Desmond. So would, presumably, every piece of paper that had been inside it. Florence found a payphone outside a CVS 3 blocks from the Comfort Inn and called the county clerk's office in Carthridge Hollow. She gave the address of the house. The woman on the line told her, after a pause and the clack of a keyboard, that the property at 14 Brindle Lane had been deeded over by quitclaim from Florence Marie Quintrell to Desmond Allen Halvorson on the 16th of October, 2025, the day before her labor began. The quitclaim, the woman said, had been signed and notarized. The signature on file was Florence's. The notary had been a man named Pell Ottinger who operated out of a UPS store franchise in the next town over. Florence had not signed any quitclaim. She had never met a man named Pell Ottinger. She had been 38 weeks pregnant on the 16th of October, sitting on the couch in the very house being deeded away, eating saltines because she could not keep down anything else, and watching a documentary about glaciers. The forgery had been amateur enough that a competent lawyer could probably get the deed reversed. That was what Olamide said when Florence called her back, and that was what the legal aid attorney said when Florence got an appointment 3 days later, and that was what every reasonable person who heard the story said. The trouble was that a competent lawyer cost money, and litigation took time, and Florence had $211 in a checking account that had been joint until Desmond closed his half of it the morning after the locks were changed. Litigation would take 8 months minimum, maybe a year, maybe 2 if Desmond's family lawyer dragged it out, which Desmond's family lawyer, a man named Calvin Halvorson who was also Desmond's older brother, would absolutely do. The legal aid attorney was a woman named Pilar Esmer who worked out of a converted dental office above a vape shop in Kingston. The reception area still had the wallpaper border of cartoon teeth running around the top. Pilar was small and tired-looking and around 50, with a habit of pushing her reading glasses up onto her forehead and forgetting them there. She listened to Florence's account with her hands folded over a yellow pad, and when Florence stopped speaking, Pilar said, "Mrs. Quintrell, I want to be straight with you. The good news is that what your husband did is a felony in 3 different ways. The bad news is that I have 1 paralegal and a caseload of 147 open files, and your case is going to sit on my desk for a long time before I can do anything substantive about it. I will file the police report with you. I will file a notice of fraudulent conveyance with the county clerk. After that, you are going to have to be patient in a way that I know is not fair to ask." Florence had thanked her and walked back out into the cold air of February and waited for the bus in the parking lot of a Dollar General with her hands in her coat pockets and Wren asleep in the carrier strapped to her chest. And she had thought about the word patient and about all the ways that word could mean things it was not meant to mean. A week after the police report was filed, Calvin Halvorson left her a voicemail. The message was brief and almost cheerful. Calvin's voice was the kind of voice that had been to a good private school and had spent 20 years making it slightly more pleasant to listen to than it had been at the start. He said her name. He said he understood there had been some confusion regarding the property on Brindle Lane. He said his brother Desmond was a reasonable man who wanted to make sure Florence and the baby were taken care of, and that there was no need for any of this to become unpleasant. He said he had drafted a small settlement document, very simple, that would allow Florence to walk away with a one-time payment of $5,000 in exchange for releasing any further claims to the marital property. He said he hoped she would call him back at her convenience. He said he was sure they could be reasonable together. Florence listened to the message 4 times standing at the payphone outside the CVS, and then she walked the 4 blocks back to the shelter and sat on the edge of the twin bed and wrote down every word Calvin had said, verbatim, in her yellow legal pad. She did not call him back. She did not call him back the next day either. She did not call him back at all. Pilar Esmer, when Florence brought the legal pad to their next appointment, read what Florence had written and made a small humming sound under her breath that did not have any cheerful quality to it. And she said, "Good. He's nervous. He should be." Pilar tore the page out of the legal pad and put it in Florence's file. "Don't ever speak to him without me on the line. Do not call him. If he calls you, you say, 'I'm represented by counsel,' and you hang up. That's it. That's the only sentence." "All right," Florence said. "Mrs. Quintrell," Pilar said. "Florence, I want you to know something. The settlement offer is what he leads with. The settlement offer is the cheapest tool he has. The next tool is going to be more expensive for him and worse for you. He will threaten custody. He will say things about your mental state. He will say things about your fitness as a mother. He will make sure those things end up in places where they can be heard. None of it will be true. All of it will be hard. I want you to be ready for it. I'll be ready for it. Florence, I'll be ready. Pilar looked at her for a long moment over the tops of her reading glasses, which were for once on her face instead of on her forehead. Then she nodded once, slowly, the way a person nods when they have decided a thing. Florence and Wren stayed in the Comfort Inn for 9 more days on the shelter voucher, and then they moved into a single room in a converted Victorian on the wrong side of the river that housed 5 other women and their children and smelled faintly of cabbage and pine sol. The room had a twin bed and a dresser and a window that looked at the back of an auto body shop. Florence got a part-time job answering phones at a dentist's office for $15 an hour. She put Wren in a daycare cooperative the shelter ran in the basement. She filed for divorce on a fee waiver. She wrote down everything that had happened in a yellow legal pad she bought at the dollar store because Pilar Esmer had told her to. She did not let herself cry in front of Wren because Wren was already absorbing too much. The other women at the shelter were a particular kind of company. None of them asked Florence what her story was, because all of them had a version of it themselves, and asking would have meant a kind of trade that nobody wanted to make. They cooked in the shared kitchen in shifts. They watched each other's children when somebody had a court date or a doctor's appointment. The oldest of them, a woman named Vesta who had been at the shelter the longest, had been a high school chemistry teacher before her husband had emptied her retirement account and then tried to set the house on fire with her in it. And Vesta still moved with the careful precision of somebody who taught teenagers how to handle Bunsen burners. Vesta took a particular interest in Wren. Vesta said babies that age needed routine more than they needed comfort, although Wren got both. Vesta showed Florence how to mix formula with one hand while holding Wren in the other. Vesta sat with Florence one evening in February while Florence cried because her milk had finally come in 3 months late and gone away again in the space of a week, and Vesta did not say anything at all. She just sat there with her hand on Florence's back. That was the most useful thing anybody did for Florence the entire month. Wren grew. The growing was the strange consolation of the period. At 6 weeks, she had stopped looking like a wet new thing and had started looking like a person, with cheeks and a small definite chin and a kind of frowning intelligence in her eyes when Florence held her up to the window in the morning. At 10 weeks, she had begun to smile. At 14 weeks, she had laughed for the first time, in the kitchen, when Vesta dropped a wooden spoon on the linoleum. The laugh was so unexpected and so complete that every woman in the room had stopped what she was doing and turned to look, and for a moment the kitchen had been very quiet, and then Vesta had picked up the spoon and dropped it again, and Wren had laughed again, and one of the women began to cry. Florence had not been able to identify whether she herself was crying or laughing. Wren slept through the night for the first time at 4 months. The morning after, Florence had woken in a panic at 4 in the morning, thinking something had happened, and had stood over the pack and play in the dark looking down at her daughter's small, steady breathing for almost 20 minutes before she trusted it enough to go back to bed. 6 weeks passed, then 10, then 4 months. It was the 5th of March, 2026, when she finally opened the last of the boxes from the storage unit. She had been putting it off because the label on the top said photos/miscellaneous in Desmond's handwriting, and she had not been ready to look at photographs of her dead mother and her dead grandmother and her own wedding all in the same sitting. The shelter director, a Honduran woman named Aurelia who had been a social worker before she was a director, had told her gently the week before that the room had a 6-month limit and her 6th month was approaching. Florence needed to know what she owned. She needed to inventory what she could sell. So that Saturday morning, with Wren napping on a quilt on the floor, she sat cross-legged on the rag rug in the room and cut the packing tape on the last box with a steak knife she had taken from the shelter's communal kitchen. The photographs were on top, in their wicker basket. Beneath the basket was a layer of newspaper. Beneath the newspaper was a large flat object wrapped in a wool blanket. Florence unwrapped it carefully. It was a wooden picture frame about the size of a placemat, very old, the wood stained dark and pitted at the corners with what might have been water damage. Inside the frame was not a photograph. Inside the frame was a piece of stiff parchment, yellowed at the edges, with a wax seal at the bottom and copperplate handwriting that her eyes had to adjust to before she could read. She had to read it 3 times before the words made sense. The document was a deed. The deed was for a property called Bramley Mill, located on the eastern bank of the Tannerskill Creek in the township of Carthridge Hollow, county of Ulster, state of New York. The deed transferred ownership of the mill and 23.4 acres of attendant woodland from one Reuben Halsey, Sr., of Carthridge Hollow, to one Hazel Margaret Quintrell, also of Carthridge Hollow, on the 23rd of June, 1971. The signatures at the bottom were witnessed by a notary whose seal was still legible. The transaction had been recorded by the Ulster County Clerk on the 28th of June, 1971. Hazel Margaret Quintrell. Her grandmother. Her grandmother had owned a mill. Florence held the deed up to the light from the window. The watermarks on the parchment were real. The county seal looked right. The signatures looked right. Her grandmother's signature in particular looked right because Florence had seen it 100 times on Christmas cards and on the inside cover of the cookbook Hazel had given her when she got engaged. Hazel Quintrell. The same flowing M in Margaret. The same backslant on the Q. Florence had never heard her grandmother mention a mill. Not once. Hazel had died in 2017 when Florence was 25, in a small cottage in the village of Carthridge Hollow proper, on a street called Lindenhurst, in the same bed her mother had died in 2 years earlier. The estate had been thin. There had been the cottage, which Florence sold to pay off Hazel's medical bills and the funeral expenses. There had been a savings account with $11,000 in it. There had been a wedding ring and a string of cultured pearls and a kitchen full of cast-iron pans. There had been no mill. Florence had been the only direct heir. The probate had been simple. There had been no mill. She set the deed down on the rag rug very carefully. She picked up Wren, who had begun to stir, and walked her in slow circles around the small room while she tried to think. Hazel had been a private woman. Hazel had also been a woman with a temper and a long memory and an instinct for keeping things back. Hazel's husband, Florence's grandfather, a man named Sebastian Quintrell, had walked out on her in 1973 with a woman from the dry cleaners, and Hazel had refused to take alimony or even to mention his name in the house for the rest of her life. Florence had a clear memory from when she was 7 of Hazel taking her by the wrist and pulling her into the pantry and shutting the door because Sebastian's youngest brother had come to the house to ask after them, and Hazel had not wanted Florence to hear what she had to say to him. Hazel was a woman who could keep a thing back. It would not have been beyond Hazel to keep back a mill. Florence sat down on the edge of the bed with Wren on her lap and read the deed a 4th time, and then a 5th. The longer she read it, the more it stopped feeling unreal. 23.4 acres of woodland and 1 mill, deeded to her grandmother in 1971. If the property had passed to Hazel's estate at her death and Florence had been the sole heir, then by every law Florence understood it now belonged to Florence Marie Quintrell, not to Desmond Halvorsen, not to anyone Desmond had ever forged her signature for. To her. She found a working pen in her purse and wrote down the address from the deed. The Tannerskill Creek ran east of Carthridge Hollow through a wooded stretch that, as far as she remembered, had been state forest land for most of her life. She did not know there had been a mill back there. The only people she could think of who would know were the people who had lived in Carthridge Hollow for 50 years or more, and the only person in Carthridge Hollow who Florence still trusted was a woman named Augusta Pellegrino, who ran the diner on Main Street where Florence had waitressed for 2 summers in high school. Augusta would have been in her 30s when the mill was deeded over. Augusta forgot nothing. That night Florence put Wren to bed in the pack and play and sat at the desk under the window and made a plan. The bus from the shelter to Carthridge Hollow ran once a day on weekdays, leaving the shelter at 6 in the morning and arriving in Carthridge at 7:45. The return bus left Carthridge at 4 in the afternoon. She would have 8 hours. She would need someone to watch Wren, because the bus did not allow car seats and the deed inquiry could not be made with a 4-month-old on her hip in any case. Aurelia had a list of approved daycare hours that could be used in emergencies. Florence considered this an emergency. On Tuesday, the 7th of March, 2026, Florence Quintrell sat in a window seat on a Trailways bus headed north on the New York State Thruway with the deed to Bramley Mill folded inside a manila envelope inside her tote bag, and her hand on the envelope the entire way, as if it might evaporate if she stopped touching it. She watched the river through the window. She watched the bare trees go by, and the small towns, and the gas stations with their faded canopies. She watched the slow shift of the land becoming more wooded and the hills becoming more pronounced as the bus climbed into the foothills of the Catskills. She had not been back to Carthridge Hollow in 8 months. Carthridge Hollow had been where she had grown up. Carthridge Hollow had been where she had buried her grandmother and her mother. Carthridge Hollow had been where she and Desmond had bought the house on Brindle Lane, and where Desmond had taken the house from her with a stranger's notary and a forged signature. Going back there felt like walking back into a room she had only barely escaped from. She kept her hand on the envelope. She had left Wren at the shelter daycare at 5:30 in the morning. Aurelia had been at the front desk, sipping coffee from a chipped mug with a faded picture of a parrot on it. And she had taken Wren from Florence's arms and held her against her own shoulder with the practiced ease of a woman who had raised 4 children of her own and worked with other people's children for 30 years. Aurelia had said, "Go. Whatever it is, go." Florence had walked the 6 blocks to the bus station in the dark, with the cold air burning the back of her throat, and she had bought a one-way ticket because she had not been able to afford the round trip, and Augusta had told her she would handle the way back. The bus station had been empty except for an older man with a duffel bag and a young woman in scrubs and a cup of vending machine coffee that the woman was not drinking. Florence had sat on a plastic bench under the fluorescent light and held the manila envelope across her knees and thought about Hazel for a long time, more carefully than she had let herself think about Hazel in years. Hazel as she had been in the kitchen on Lindenhurst, frying eggs in a cast-iron pan with a spatula she had owned for 50 years. Hazel sitting on the porch in the evening with the radio on, listening to the Mets game and not moving. Hazel teaching Florence at 10 how to gut a trout the way Hazel's own father had taught her in the Adirondacks before the war. Hazel had been a small woman with hands like a man's, and she had not feared a thing in the world that Florence had ever observed, except possibly her own husband, who had been gone for 45 years by the time Hazel died. The bus dropped her at the corner of Main and Garrison at 7:43. The morning was cold and gray with a thin mist coming off the Hudson visible at the far end of Main Street, where the road sloped down toward the marina. Florence stood on the corner for a moment and breathed in the smell of wood smoke and diesel and wet leaves that she had not realized she missed. Then she walked the 3 blocks to Augusta's diner. The bell above the door rang the same way it had in 2007. The booths were the same red vinyl, patched in the same places. The coffee smelled the same. A radio behind the counter was playing a country station at a volume just low enough that you could ignore it if you wanted to. 2 old men in seed caps sat at the counter eating identical platters of eggs and corned beef hash, and they looked up as Florence came in, and then looked at each other in the brief assessing way that old men in small towns look at each other when somebody new walks into the room. One of them nodded to her. She nodded back. Then she saw Augusta. Augusta Pellegrino was behind the counter pouring a cup for a man in a Carhartt jacket. She was 72 now. Her hair had gone completely white, and she wore it short and curled close to her head. She had the same eyes, that flat, unimpressed brown that missed nothing. When she saw Florence in the doorway, she set the coffee pot down on the burner without looking at it, and walked around the counter and pulled Florence into a hug that smelled like bacon grease and Pond's cold cream. Augusta did not speak for a long moment. When she let Florence go, she held her at arm's length and looked at her and said, in a voice that was rougher than Florence remembered, "Honey, you should have come sooner." Florence had thought she was not going to cry. She cried. Augusta sat her down in the corner booth by the kitchen pass-through and put a plate of eggs and rye toast and home fries in front of her, and a cup of black coffee, and a small glass of orange juice that Augusta had squeezed herself that morning. She did not ask questions until Florence had eaten. The man in the Carhartt jacket left. A woman with 2 children came in and was seated near the front by the waitress. Augusta refilled Florence's coffee twice. She brought a small dish of butter for the toast and a tiny pitcher of cream that Florence did not use. She watched Florence eat with the careful sideways attention of a woman who had fed people for a living for 45 years and knew the difference between somebody who was hungry and somebody who had not had a proper meal in a long time. Florence was the second kind. Augusta said nothing about it. When Florence finished the eggs, Augusta slid a fresh slice of rye onto her plate without asking, and then a second pat of butter, and then she sat down across from Florence in the booth and folded her hands on the formica and said, "Tell me." Florence told her. "The hospital." The locks. The storage unit. The forged quitclaim. The shelter. Wren. Her arrival at the room she now lived in, with the dresser and the twin bed and the basement daycare cooperative. Augusta listened without interrupting. When Florence got to the part about Desmond's brother being the family lawyer, Augusta's jaw tightened, but she did not speak. When Florence finished, Augusta was quiet for a full minute. Then she said, "Show me what you brought." Florence took out the envelope. She slid the deed across the table. Augusta read it. She read it slowly. She turned it over and looked at the back, where there was nothing. She turned it over again and read it a second time. When she set it down on the table, her hands were trembling slightly, which Florence had never seen Augusta's hands do. "Sweetheart," Augusta said, "where in God's name did you find this?" "In a box. Desmond packed up my things and put them in storage. It was at the bottom. He packed this." Augusta's voice was flat. He didn't know what it was. It was framed. He probably thought it was just an old photograph or something my grandmother had on her wall. Augusta laughed once, a sharp, dry sound. He didn't know what it was. "Florence, baby." He didn't know what it was. "Augusta, what is it?" Augusta looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Hold on." She got up and went to the kitchen pass-through and called something to the cook, and then she came back and slid into the booth across from Florence and lowered her voice and said, "Your grandmother bought that mill from Reuben Halsey in 1971 for $1. $1. $1. He owed her something. Don't ask me what. He's still alive. He's 91 years old, and he lives in the assisted living on Putnam Street, and he still has all his marbles, which is more than I can say for half my regulars. He'll tell you the story himself if you ask him. The mill hasn't been operated since 1968. The county tried to take it for back taxes in 1989, and your grandmother paid them off in cash. The county tried again in 2003, and she paid them again. After she died, I don't know what happened to it. I figured your mother or somebody else got it. I figured it had been sold." "Augusta, there was nothing in the estate. There was no mill. The lawyer never mentioned a mill." "Which lawyer?" "Calvin Halvorson." The silence that followed was a particular kind of silence. Augusta's face did not change, but her hands curled flat against the table. After a moment, in a voice that was very careful, she said, "Calvin Halvorson handled your grandmother's estate. He was the only lawyer I knew. Desmond recommended him. He gave me a discount because of Desmond." "Florence, I know what you're about to say. He told you there was nothing. He told me there was the cottage and the savings account and the personal effects. He told me everything else had been resolved before her death. I signed the paperwork he put in front of me. I was 25. I was grieving. I trusted him." Augusta closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, they were very steady. "All right," she said. "All right. Let's not go down that road yet. Let's go look at the mill." The mill was at the end of a fire road that turned off Route 213 4 miles east of the village. Augusta drove them in her old Subaru, with Florence in the passenger seat and the deed back in its envelope on her lap. The fire road was rutted and unmaintained, and they had to stop twice for fallen branches. Augusta got out the first time and dragged the branch off the road without comment, the way a person who has lived in the country for 40 years moves a branch off a road, without theatrics or hesitation. The second time, Florence got out and helped. Her stitches were long since healed, but her back still ached if she lifted too much, and Augusta caught her wincing and took the heavy end of the branch without saying anything about it. The trees on either side were enormous, old oaks and hemlocks that closed in over the road and made the morning dimmer than it had any business being. There were old stumps along the verge, the bigger ones over 4 feet across, the kind that meant somebody had logged the original growth timber out of this land 120 years ago. The stumps were the only sign that human beings had ever been back here. Florence watched the woods go by and tried to imagine her grandmother driving this road in 1971, in some kind of Ford pickup probably, in a cotton dress and a sweater, 23 years old, and the new owner of a mill she had paid $1 for. What was she like then? Florence said. In 1971. You would have known her. Augusta did not take her eyes off the road. I was 28 when she bought this place. I had just bought the diner. I had $400 to my name and a mortgage on a building with no working stove. Your grandmother was younger than me by about 5 years. She was already a widow and everything but paperwork. Sebastian had been gone 2 years by then. Wouldn't sign the divorce papers, but he was gone, and Hazel was getting on with it. She had your mother, who was, what, 2 years old. She was working as a bookkeeper for the Halsey lumberyard. Reuben Halsey ran the lumberyard. The Halseys had owned the mill, way back, before they got into lumber. The mill had been sitting empty since the late 40s. After Reuben sold it to her, your grandmother quit the lumberyard and started doing books for half the businesses in town instead, on her own. Worked out of her kitchen, set her own hours. She used to come to the diner every Wednesday morning for breakfast and bring me an envelope with my ledger reconciled. She was my grandmother. I don't think I ever met a person who was that organized. She was that organized because she had to be. Nobody was going to help her. Nobody had. Her own mother had died when Hazel was 8, and her father had been a hard man, and she'd worked for everything she had since she was 13 years old. You could say a lot of things about your grandmother, Florence, but the one thing you could not say is that she ever expected anybody else to do a single thing for her. Did she ever say what she kept out there? At the mill? No, sweetheart. She did not. I asked her once, back in maybe 1985. We were friendly enough by then. I said, Hazel, what do you do out at that mill of yours? And she gave me a look, and she said, Augusta, what I do is my business, and that's how I'd like it to stay. And I did not ask her again, because she was not the kind of woman you asked twice. The road opened into a small clearing at the edge of the creek, and there it was. Bramley Mill was a 3-story stone building with a steep gambrel roof and a wooden water wheel rotted out against the southern face. The stone was that rough, gray field stone that the Hudson Valley quarried for 200 years, set in mortar that had crumbled at the corners but held in the walls. The windows on the upper floors had been boarded up at some point, and the boards had weathered to the color of driftwood. A wide wooden door, painted dark green a long time ago, faced the clearing. Ivy had grown up the eastern wall and across the roofline. A small outbuilding stood about 30 feet to one side, also stone, also boarded. The Tannerskill Creek ran clear and shallow behind the mill, running fast over the rocks where the wheel had once turned. The clearing was deep in dead leaves. There was no sign that anyone had been here in years. There was no posted notice. There were no surveyor's flags. The building stood alone in the woods exactly as it must have stood for the 55 years since her grandmother had bought it. Florence got out of the car. The air was wet and cold and smelled like moss and creek water. She walked to the front door and put her hand on it. The wood was solid. The padlock on the hasp was old, brass, the kind that takes a long key. Augusta had come up beside her. Augusta said quietly, "You'll need a locksmith. Or a pair of bolt cutters. Don't break it yourself. You want this clean. You want every step of this on the record. If anybody tries to argue later that you broke and entered, you want to be able to say a locksmith opened your own door for you at your direction." "It's mine," Florence said. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears. "It's yours," Augusta said. "Reuben signed it to your grandmother, and your grandmother left it to you. It's yours." They stood there in the leaves for a long time, the two of them, looking at the mill. The morning mist was beginning to lift. A crow called from somewhere up in the hemlocks. The water wheel creaked once, very faintly, when a gust of wind caught it. "Augusta," Florence said, "what was inside? When my grandmother had it, did she store something here?" Augusta did not answer for a moment. Then she said, "Honey, I don't know. Hazel never let anybody in. Not me, not the county, not Reuben after he sold it to her. She used to come out here once or twice a month for 30 years. Sometimes she'd be gone all day, sometimes overnight. She had a cot, I think. She had a kerosene lamp. She had a padlock on the door that she never gave anybody the key to. After she got sick, I don't think she came out anymore. I don't think anybody's been inside since maybe 2014 or 2015. Whatever is in there, it's been waiting." Florence pressed her palm flat against the green wooden door. It was cold. It was the kind of cold that comes off old stone in March. "Augusta," she said, "I need a locksmith." Augusta took her phone out of the pocket of her coat. "I know one," she said. "He owes me. He'll come out today. He'll come out this afternoon. You can ride back into town with me, and we'll get him on the line, and we'll come back here together before the bus. You'll be home with the baby tonight, and you'll have keys in your purse to a building that belongs to you. All right." Florence nodded. She could not speak. Augusta touched her shoulder. "Sweetheart," she said, "I want you to look at me a minute." Florence turned. Augusta's face was very serious. "Whatever's in there," Augusta said. Whether it's $1,000 in a coffee can or whether it's nothing but mouse nests in your grandmother's old shoes, you understand me. This is a real thing. This is real. He took your house. He did not take this. He did not even know this existed. Some things, baby, some things are still yours. Florence nodded again. Her eyes were burning. Augusta squeezed her shoulder once and walked back to the car to make the call. Florence stood in the leaves and looked at the mill that her grandmother had paid $1 for in 1971, and she thought about all the things Hazel Margaret Quintrell had kept back from everyone, including her own granddaughter. She thought about the 7 years she had visited Hazel in the cottage on Lindenhurst, the long afternoons drinking tea in the small kitchen, the trips to the cemetery on Memorial Day to lay flowers. She thought about how many times Hazel must have looked at her and thought about telling her, and then decided not to, and folded the telling away for some later day that never came. She thought about how Hazel had finally, in the last weeks of her life, given Florence the framed parchment from her wall and told her to keep it safe. She had said it was a family thing. She had said Florence would know what to do with it. Florence had not opened the back of the frame because Hazel had said not to. Florence had hung the frame in the upstairs hallway of the house on Brindle Lane and dusted around it for almost a decade without ever once turning it over. The locksmith arrived at 1 in the afternoon. His name was Yusuf, and he was about 30, and he had a son the same age as Wren, and Augusta had once cooked Thanksgiving dinner for his family the year his wife was in the hospital. He looked at the padlock and the hasp in the door. He took out a small drill and a set of picks and a tension wrench. He worked at the lock for about 4 minutes, and the padlock fell open in his hand. He stepped back. He did not touch the door. "It's all yours," he said. "I'll wait in the truck." Florence stood at the threshold. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. The hasp swung free against the wood with a small dull sound. The door was the kind that opened inward, with a wrought iron handle worn smooth in the middle where a hand had gripped it 10,000 times. She put her hand on the handle. The metal was cold. She looked over her shoulder. Augusta was standing about 10 feet behind her in the leaves, hands in her coat pockets, watching her with an expression Florence could not read. "Go on," Augusta said. "Whatever it is. Whatever it isn't. You go on." Florence pulled the door open. A breath of cold, dry air came out of the building, smelling of stone and old timber and something else she could not identify, something faintly sweet and faintly metallic. The interior was very dark. The light from the open door fell in a slanted rectangle across a stone floor swept almost clean of dust. She could see the shape of a long wooden table about 10 feet inside. She could see something hanging from the rafters, perhaps an oil lamp on a chain. She could see, beyond the table, a tall wooden cabinet against the far wall, its doors closed. There was no sound from inside the building at all. Not a mouse, not a settle of timber, not the small creak that old buildings make when the temperature changes. The interior was as still as a held breath. Florence's hand was still on the iron handle. She could feel Augusta watching from behind. She could feel the cold, dry air on her face. She could feel the weight of 55 years of her grandmother's silence resting against the open door, against her palm, against the thin envelope still tucked into her tote bag with the deed inside it that had her grandmother's signature at the bottom in the same cue she had taught Florence to write when Florence was 5 years old at the kitchen table on Lindenhurst. She took one step forward into the long rectangle of light. The stone floor was uneven where the threshold gave way to the interior, and Florence steadied herself on the door frame before she took a second step. The light from the open door reached about 15 feet into the building before it gave up against the dark. She let her eyes adjust. Augusta came in behind her and stood just inside the doorway and did not speak. The air inside was about 10 degrees colder than the air outside. The cold was the dry stone cold of a building that had been sealed for years. There was no smell of mold. There was no smell of damp. Hazel had built this place to keep things, and the things she had built it to keep had stayed dry. The long wooden table that Florence had seen first stretched almost the entire length of the front room. It was an oak workbench, scarred and ringed and dark with old varnish, and it had been wiped clean. A row of small tools hung from a pegboard above it, each in its outline drawn in black marker on the wood. Pliers, 3 sizes. A jeweler's loop on a leather lanyard. A pair of brass calipers. A small set of files. A magnifying glass on a swivel mount. A green-shaded desk lamp at one end of the bench had the cord running down behind it, untied, into the gap between the bench and the wall. Florence followed the cord with her eye. The cord disappeared into a brass plate set into the stone of the wall, the kind of conduit that meant somebody had wired this building in the 1970s and had done it properly. "There's power," Augusta said behind her. "I'd guess solar. Maybe a propane generator." Hazel didn't have the line run out here. Too obvious. Too easy to ask the linemen what they were doing way out at the end of that fire road. Florence nodded. She was not yet able to speak. At the far end of the bench stood the kerosene lamp she had seen from the doorway, hanging on a chain from a hook in the beam above. The lamp was clean. The wick was trimmed. A small box of matches sat on the bench beneath it. Florence had a clear memory of those matches. Hazel had used the same brand for as long as Florence could remember, the green and red striker on the side, Ohio blue tip. She picked up the box. The matches inside rattled. She set it down. To the left of the bench, against the eastern wall, was a small cast iron stove with a kettle on top of it. The stovepipe ran up through the ceiling. A neat stack of split hardwood, perhaps 2 cords worth, was stored beneath the bench, dry as paper. Beside the stove was a single iron cot with a folded gray wool blanket on it, military surplus probably, with a label stenciled in black ink that Florence could read from where she stood. U.S. Army, 1953. The mattress on the cot was thin and clean. A small enamel basin sat on a stand beside it. The basin had a chip on its rim that had been smoothed over with what looked like a layer of clear varnish to prevent it from cutting anyone. Against the far wall was the tall cabinet she had seen first from the doorway. 8 feet high, 4 feet wide, dark stained oak, with 2 long doors and an iron lock plate set between them. The lock was the kind that took a flat brass key. Florence took a step further into the room. Her shoes made very little sound on the stone floor. "Hazel," she said, out loud, without meaning to. The room held the sound and absorbed it. There was no echo. The walls were too thick. Augusta moved up beside her. "Take your time, sweetheart. We've got hours." The wooden floor of the loft above ran across the entire upper level of the building, accessible by a steep set of wooden stairs against the western wall. Florence looked up. She could see the shape of more shelving above, and what looked like an old desk with a chair pushed neatly under it. The stairs were swept. The handrail was smooth. Florence walked the long way around the table to the cabinet against the far wall and stood in front of it. She put her hand on the iron lock plate. The metal was cold, but it was not corroded. Somebody had oiled it within the last few years, or somebody had built it well enough that it had not needed oiling. She tried the doors. The doors did not open. The lock was engaged. "Augusta," she said, "there's no key in the door. There's no key on the workbench. Look on the cot, under the blanket, or under the mattress." Hazel was not a fancy hider. Hazel hid things in the obvious place and trusted that nobody would think she'd be that obvious. Florence walked back to the cot. She lifted the wool blanket. She lifted the corner of the mattress. Beneath the mattress, lying flat against the canvas of the cot frame, was a small brass key on a length of green twine. The twine had been knotted and tied around one of the metal slats so that the key would not slide out of place even if the cot was tipped. Hazel had hidden the key in the obvious place and had also made sure it would stay where she put it. Florence picked up the key. She walked back to the cabinet. The key fit. The lock turned over with a small dry click, and the doors swung open of their own weight, very slowly, as if they had been weighted to do exactly that. The inside of the cabinet was lined with green felt. There were 6 shelves. On each shelf, in tidy rows, sat ledger books. The ledgers were the old kind, dark green canvas spines, with years embossed in gold on the front in Hazel's own handwriting. Florence counted them. There were 34 ledgers. The earliest was dated 1971. The latest was dated 2015. Florence took down the earliest ledger and laid it on the workbench and opened it. Hazel's handwriting filled the first page. Date entries in the left-hand column. Descriptions in the middle. Amounts in the right-hand column. The first entry was dated the 28th of June, 1971. The entry read, Mill, paid R. Halsey, $1.00. Below it, the second entry was dated the 3rd of August, 1971, and it read, 1 Liberty Gold coin, 1907, purchased at Albany estate sale, $42.00. The third entry, dated the 11th of August, 1971, read, Silver tea service, Wallace, circa 1898, purchased privately from C. Mathers, $115. 00. Florence kept reading. She turned the page. The fourth entry was a piece of furniture. The fifth was another coin. The sixth was a small lot of jewelry. The seventh was a length of antique lace. The eighth was a Tiffany sterling silver bowl. The entries continued down the page in the same careful column. The amounts ranged from $3 to $210. At the bottom of the page, Hazel had written the year's total in red ink. 1971, $1,847. 00. Florence turned to the next page. 1972, the same pattern. Coins, silver, the occasional piece of jewelry, an antique pocket watch, a set of spode china. At the bottom of the year's column, $2,961. 00. The year after that, 1973, $3,408. 00. The year after that, 1974, $3,712. 00. Florence skipped ahead. 1989, $11,440. 00. 1995, $14,206. 00. 2001, $17,890. 00. 2010, $9,640. 00. 2015, the last year, for $1,200. 00. With a final entry in November of that year reading, in a handwriting that was visibly weaker than the earlier entries, stopped collecting. Tired. Florence closed the ledger. Her hands were shaking. Augusta, she said. Augusta was leaning against the workbench, watching her. Augusta's face was very still. Augusta, there are 44 years of these. 44 years. I know there are, baby. She spent every spare dollar she had for 44 years buying things. I know. Where are they? Augusta gestured with her chin at the cabinet. Not in here, sweetheart. This is the record. The things themselves are somewhere else. Florence walked back to the cabinet and ran her hand along the underside of each shelf. She felt for false bottoms. She felt for catches. The cabinet held only the ledgers. There were no hidden compartments. There was no false back. She turned and looked at the room. The stone walls, the high ceiling, the loft above, the cot, the stove, the workbench. The single door at the back of the main floor, which she had not noticed before, set into the southern wall, painted the same dark green as the front door, with the same kind of iron hasp and a smaller padlock. She walked to it. The door looked like the door to a storeroom. She tried the padlock. The padlock was engaged. She tried the brass key from the cabinet. The brass key did not fit. There's another lock, she said. There's another door. There must be another key. Augusta nodded once. There will be. Hazel did not hide one key. Hazel hid as many keys as she needed. They'll all be in obvious places. We'll find them. But not today. The locksmith has gone back to town. We have to take the bus, both of us, in an hour. We will come back tomorrow. Florence stood in front of the green door at the back of the main floor and looked at it for a long moment. The padlock was older than the one on the front door. The hasp was bigger. The wood of the door itself was scarred at the bottom edge where something heavy had been dragged across it many times. All right, she said. All right. Tomorrow. They closed up carefully. Augusta knew how, having watched the locksmith do it, and Florence watched her. They put the front door back the way they had found it, with the original padlock that Yusuf had picked open now resting on the hasp again, refastened. Augusta had brought a new padlock from her shop drawer at the diner, but they did not use it yet. Augusta said the new lock could go on tomorrow, when they had time to install it properly with a fresh hasp. For tonight, the picked old lock looked engaged enough that anyone passing would not see a difference, and nobody was going to pass. Augusta drove Florence back into town. Florence sat in the passenger seat of the Subaru with the ledger from 1971 in her lap, because Augusta had said to take one of them, just one, because if anything happened to the building before tomorrow they would need at least the record. Florence held the ledger flat against her thighs. She did not open it again in the car. She looked out the window at the trees going past and thought about what Hazel had been doing for 44 years and how she had never said a word about it to anyone. At the diner, Augusta made her a sandwich for the bus, ham and Swiss on rye with mustard, and wrapped it in waxed paper, and put a thermos of coffee into Florence's tote bag, and added a $5 bill folded into a diner of Carthridge Hollow business card. Florence tried to refuse the money. Augusta said, "Sweetheart, I'm going to give you a great deal worse than that before this is over, and I do not want to argue about any of it today, so put the money away." The bus left at 4. Florence rode south with the ledger in her tote bag and the deed in the manila envelope on top of the ledger and the thermos of coffee in her lap. She watched the river. She watched the light fade. She got off at the shelter stop at 5:40 and walked the 6 blocks to the Victorian with her hand inside the tote bag on top of the ledger the entire way. Aurelia was at the front desk doing paperwork when Florence came in. Aurelia looked up. Aurelia did not ask the question, but her eyebrows lifted, and Florence understood the eyebrows. Florence said, "It's there. The mill is real. Whatever it is, it's real." Aurelia set the pen down on the paperwork. She got up from behind the desk and walked around to Florence's side and pulled Florence into a hug that smelled like clove cigarettes, which Aurelia had not smoked in 15 years, but the smell had never quite left her clothes. Aurelia held her for a long moment. Then she stepped back and held Florence's shoulders and looked at her face and said in a low voice, "Wren is asleep. She had a good day. Eat something. Take a shower. We will talk in the morning." Florence ate the sandwich Augusta had made. Standing in the kitchen at the shelter, because she found that she did not want to take it to the room and eat it where Wren was sleeping. She washed her face in the communal bathroom and brushed her teeth, and went up to the room and stood over the pack and play for a long time looking down at her daughter, sleeping on her back with her hands curled into small fists beside her head. Wren was 4.5 months old. Wren had not yet seen the building her great-grandmother had bought in 1971 for $1. Wren had not yet seen the cabinet full of ledgers. Wren had no idea that today had been the day everything began to change. Florence sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. She held the 1971 ledger in her lap. She did not open it. She held it for a long time. After a while, she put it on the floor under the bed and lay down on top of the covers without taking her clothes off, and she fell asleep, and she did not dream. The next morning at 6, she fed Wren a bottle and put her in the carrier and put the carrier on her chest and put the 1971 ledger back in the tote bag and walked the 6 blocks to the bus station and bought another one-way ticket. Aurelia had said the room would be held. Aurelia had said the daycare would be there when she returned. Aurelia had also said, very quietly, that there was a women's housing program in Ulster County run by a Methodist church that took mothers with infants and provided a furnished room and 3 months of free childcare, and that Aurelia had a phone number for the director. Aurelia had said that if the mill came with a deed and the deed came with an address, then Florence's situation could change in ways that had not been available to her before. Aurelia had said this without any inflection at all. Florence had nodded. Augusta met her at the bus station at 7:43. Augusta had already brought Yusuf back with her. Yusuf had a fresh hasp and a new padlock and a small drill and a willingness to spend the morning at the mill installing things properly. Augusta had also brought a thermos of coffee, 2 more sandwiches, a fleece blanket for Wren, and a cardboard box of basic supplies. A propane lantern, a flashlight, a roll of paper towels, bottled water, a folding camp chair. Augusta had not been told to bring these things. Augusta knew what people needed when they were beginning to live somewhere they had not lived before. They drove out to the mill together in the Subaru. Wren slept against Florence's chest the entire way, which was a small mercy. Augusta did not ask whether Florence had thought about the situation overnight, and Florence did not offer. There was nothing yet to think about that had a shape Florence could put words on. Yusuf installed the new hasp and the new padlock in about 35 minutes while Florence stood with Wren in the clearing and Augusta sat on a fallen log nearby with the thermos. The new padlock was heavy and silver and came with 3 keys. Yusuf handed all 3 keys to Florence and told her to put one of them somewhere safe that she would not normally check, in case she lost the other 2. He did not charge her. He said Augusta had taken care of it. He drove off in his truck back down the fire road, and the clearing was very quiet after he left. Florence sat down in the camp chair Augusta had unfolded for her near the door of the mill. Augusta took Wren and held her, and Wren did not wake up. Florence put her face in her hands for a few minutes and breathed. Augusta said nothing. The creek ran behind the mill, and a wind moved through the upper branches of the hemlocks, and somewhere very far off a woodpecker was working. After a while, Florence stood up and unlocked the new padlock with the new silver key, and they went back inside. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. They spent the morning inside. Augusta held Wren in the corner while Florence walked the building slowly, taking notes in a small notebook she had also bought at the dollar store. The main floor was a workshop. The loft above was an office with a desk and a typewriter and a long bookshelf full of reference books on numismatics and silver hallmarks and antique furniture and china marks and gemology. The desk had a small lamp and a desk blotter and 3 sharpened pencils and a tin cup. The bookshelf had been arranged alphabetically by subject. Florence picked one of the books off the shelf at random. The pages had been turned often. Hazel's pencil annotations ran down the margins in a steady, neat hand. Florence put the book back. She walked the length of the loft to the desk and sat down in the chair. The typewriter on the desk was a Smith Corona Galaxy 12 from the 1960s, in robin's egg blue, the kind of typewriter that secretaries had used for 30 years before the office market changed. There was paper in the platen. The paper was an unfinished letter dated the 8th of April, 2015. The letter began, "Marigold," and stopped after 2 sentences. The 2 sentences read, "I do not have many months left, and I have decided to write everything down. If you do not want to read it, then I ask you to please keep it anyway, so that one day if Florence wants to read it, she may." After the second sentence, the page was blank. Hazel had run out of energy in that sentence, or she had thought better of it, or she had been called away, or she had simply put it off until a later day that never came. The paper was the color of old cream. Florence touched the edge of it lightly with one finger. She did not pull it out of the typewriter. She did not want to disturb anything. She would let the typewriter stay the way Hazel had left it. There were other things on the desk that Florence let her eye move over without lingering. A small jar of paste with the lid screwed on. A pair of reading glasses folded on top of a green blotter. A leather coin album, slim and dark, lying flat at the edge of the desk with a strip of paper marking a page near the back. A glass paperweight in the shape of a hen, of the kind that turn-of-the-century glass factories had made by the thousands. Each of these things had been arranged by Hazel and left by Hazel for somebody to find later. Florence understood, looking at the desk, that the building was not just a workshop and not just a vault. It was also a kind of long letter that Hazel had been writing across a span of 44 years in objects rather than in words, a letter addressed to whichever woman in her family eventually found her way back to it. The locked door at the back of the main floor was still locked. Florence had not yet found the second key. She did not force it. She did not want anything in this building forced. She wanted everything to open the way Hazel had meant for it to open. At noon, while Wren was nursing on a clean bottle of formula Augusta had warmed on the cast iron stove, Florence found Hazel's letters. They were in the second drawer of the desk in the loft, in a wooden box lined with tissue paper, tied together with a length of pale blue ribbon. There were 31 letters. They were addressed to Florence's mother, whose name had been Marigold Quintrell, and they were dated from 1972 to 1991. Marigold had died in 2015, 3 months before Hazel. Marigold had never opened them. The seals were intact. The dates were on the front of each envelope in Hazel's handwriting. Florence's mother had received these letters at her home in Carthridge Hollow over the course of 20 years and had returned them to her mother unopened. Florence sat down on the wooden floor of the loft holding the bundle. She did not open any of them. She put the bundle gently into her tote bag. She would read them somewhere else, slowly, in her own time, where there were no other eyes. Hazel and Marigold had not spoken for the last 10 years of Marigold's life. Florence had always known this. Florence had never asked why. Florence had assumed it was the way of women in their family. The way Hazel had also stopped speaking to her own sisters in the 1960s. The way Marigold had stopped speaking to 2 of her cousins in the 1980s. Florence had assumed these were small private rifts that did not concern her. Florence had been wrong, apparently, although she did not yet know in what way. Florence's phone buzzed in her coat pocket at 12:43. She took it out. The screen showed an unfamiliar number with a Kingston area code. She let it ring 3 times before she answered it. The voice was Calvin Halvorson's, the cheerful voice that had been to a good private school. He said her name. He said, "Florence, I wanted to check in. I have been hearing some interesting things this morning, and I wondered if you had a few minutes to talk." Florence walked to the front door of the mill and stepped outside into the clearing so that she would not be heard by Augusta, although Augusta was holding Wren in the corner and could not have heard her in any case. The afternoon air was cold on her face. She kept the phone away from her mouth for a long moment so that he would not hear her breathing. "Calvin," she said, "I'm represented by counsel. You can call Pilar Esmer." "I know that, Florence. I called Pilar this morning. Pilar said she was happy for me to call you about a non-litigation matter. I am calling to suggest that we have lunch. Just the two of us. There is something I would like to show you. There is something I would like to give you, in fact. I think you will find it useful." "Calvin, Pilar did not say you could call me. Pilar would not say that." "Pilar can confirm. I have a witness on my end." "Florence, please. I am trying to be reasonable. I have a copy of a property record I think you should see. Specifically, a property record that pertains to an address you may already be familiar with, which I would describe as a wooded location east of Route 213. I think you understand which address I mean. I am offering to share my copy with you, professional courtesy, because I think there has been a misunderstanding in the chain of title that I would like to clear up before it becomes anybody's problem. Can we meet at 1:30 at the Hollander Inn on Main Street? I am already in town. I can wait." Florence pressed her free hand flat against the cold stone wall of the mill. The wall did not move. The wall had been here for 210 years, and it was not going to move because Calvin Halvorson wanted it to. She let the cold of the stone come up through her palm and into her wrist, and she breathed. "Calvin," she said, "I'm going to hang up. I am going to call Pilar. If Pilar tells me you have her permission to speak with me, I will call you back. If Pilar tells me you do not, you will not hear from me again. Either way, you will not see me at the Hollander Inn at 1:30. "Florence, I really think," she ended the call. She stood in the clearing holding the phone. Her hand was steady, which surprised her. She put the phone back in her pocket. She went back inside. Augusta was watching her from the corner. Augusta said, "Halvorson. His brother. What did he want?" "He says he has a copy of a property record. He says he wants to clear up a misunderstanding before it becomes anybody's problem. He knows about the mill. He knows something." Augusta nodded slowly. "He has a friend at the clerk's office. 2 friends, maybe. He had to dig to find out. He's been digging. Florence, sweetheart, this means we are not going to have as much time as I hoped. He will not move on the mill today. He will not move on it tomorrow. But he will move on it within a week, and when he does, he will move on it from 3 directions at once, because that is how Calvin Halvorson does anything. We need to get inside that back room today. We need to get the contents inventoried, photographed, and recorded with the county and with a lawyer who is not Pilar Esmer, because Pilar is a wonderful woman who has 1 paralegal and 147 files, and we need a lawyer who has nothing else on her desk this week. I have a name. I will call her on the way back into town." Florence nodded. She called Pilar from the clearing. Pilar picked up on the second ring. Pilar said she had not given Calvin Halvorson permission to speak with Florence, that she would never give Calvin Halvorson permission to speak with Florence, and that Calvin Halvorson knew it. Pilar said she was filing a complaint with the state bar by close of business. Pilar also said, in a quieter voice, that what Calvin had just done was a sign of nervousness, and that nervous attorneys made mistakes, and that Florence should let her know if Calvin called again, but otherwise should not engage. Florence said she would not engage. Florence hung up. At 1 in the afternoon, Augusta said it was time to drive into town to see somebody. Augusta had been thinking about it overnight. There was one person in Carthridge Hollow who would know more about the mill than Augusta did, and that person was a retired librarian named Idris Whitcomb, who had been the head of the Historical Society for 30 years and who had also been one of Hazel's 2 or 3 close friends in the last 20 years of her life. Idris was 83. Idris was sharp. Idris had been the only black librarian in Ulster County for almost his entire career, and he had collected the local history of the county the way other people collected stamps, because he had understood that the history of a place was not safe in any one person's head, and he had wanted to make sure that what he knew was written down somewhere it could be found. Idris lived in a small greenhouse on Tulip Street with his wife Cleotha, who had been a pediatrician before her retirement and was a year older than Idris and still saw patients on Tuesdays as a favor to the clinic. Augusta called ahead. Cleotha said, "Come over." They drove over. Wren was awake by then, looking around with the alert, wide-eyed attention of a baby who had figured out that the world was bigger than the inside of the carrier. Idris met them at the door in a cardigan the color of bourbon. He was tall and very thin and bald, and he had a small white mustache, and his eyes behind his bifocals were very dark and very kind. He shook Florence's hand. He looked at Wren and made the small clicking sound that people make at babies, and Wren stared at him with the wide, open consideration of an infant who has not yet learned that staring is rude. Cleotha brought coffee and shortbread to the front room and sat down in an armchair with her hands folded and listened. Florence told the whole story. The hospital, the locks, the deed in the box, the trip yesterday, the cabinet of ledgers, the 31 letters from Hazel to Marigold that Marigold had returned unopened, the locked back door at the mill, the second key she had not yet found. Idris listened without interrupting. He did not move except to nod once or twice, very slightly. When Florence finished, Idris looked at his wife. Cleotha looked back at him. Some communication passed between them that did not need to be put into words. Then Idris turned back to Florence and said, in a voice that was deeper and slower than she had expected, "Mrs. Quintrell, Florence, your grandmother and I were friends for a long time. There are some things she asked me to remember for her, in case anybody ever came to ask. I have been waiting for somebody to come and ask for 31 years. I am very glad it is you." Florence had not been expecting this. She set her coffee cup down on the saucer. She said, "What did she ask you to remember?" Idris folded his hands on the arm of his chair. 3 things, mainly. First, that Reuben Halsey sold her the mill because Reuben's father had taken something from Hazel's father in 1939 that was not his to take. Hazel never told me what it was. She said it was not for me to know. She said Reuben understood, and that $1 and a quitclaim was Reuben's way of settling the account between the families. She said Reuben was a good man whose father had been a bad one, and the mill was Reuben's making it right. Second, that she was using the mill to store things she intended to leave to your mother. Your mother knew this. Your mother had been told. Your mother had also been told what was in the back room, and your mother had not wanted any of it, because your mother had reasons of her own that I will let you discover for yourself when you read the letters. Hazel told me your mother had been very firm about this, and that Hazel had decided to keep collecting anyway, because Hazel believed that one day there would be a 3rd generation, and that the 3rd generation might feel differently than the 2nd. Idris paused. He took a sip of his coffee and set the cup down on the small table beside his chair. "Third," he said, "Hazel told me that if anybody ever came asking after her mill, that person should be sent to Reuben himself, if Reuben was still alive. Reuben Halsey is 91 years old. He lives at the assisted living facility on Putnam Street. He has all his marbles, as Augusta would tell you. Reuben has been waiting also, although I will say that Reuben has been waiting less patiently than I have, because Reuben does not have all the time in the world. I would suggest, Florence, that we go and see Reuben this afternoon. He will want to meet you. He will want to give you the 2nd key." Florence stared at him for a long moment. Then she said, "He has the 2nd key. He has had the 2nd key since 1971, Idris said. Hazel gave it to him for safekeeping. Hazel said, very specifically, that the 2nd key was not to be given to anybody who could not produce the deed. Hazel said that anybody who came looking for the 2nd key without the deed in their hand was somebody who had no business asking. You have the deed. Reuben will give you the key." Augusta said quietly, "I'll get the car." The assisted living facility on Putnam Street was a brick 3-story building that had been a Catholic school until 1992 and a senior center since then. The front lobby smelled like floor cleaner and very old roses. The woman at the front desk knew Augusta and waved them through without checking the visitor log. Reuben Halsey's room was on the 2nd floor at the end of the south corridor, with a window that looked out over the rear parking lot, and beyond it to a stand of paper birches that had been planted 40 years before by a junior class as a memorial to a teacher who had drowned. Reuben was sitting in a recliner near the window with a thick paperback novel open on his lap. He wore a flannel shirt and corduroy trousers and a pair of sheepskin slippers. His hair was very thin and very white. His hands on the arms of the recliner were heavy and knobbed with arthritis. When Idris came in, Reuben looked up and his face shifted in a way that suggested he had been expecting them, although his eyes had not been on the door. "Reuben," Idris said, "this is Hazel Quintrell's granddaughter Florence. She has the deed." Reuben Halsey looked at Florence for a long moment. He did not get up. He could not get up, Florence understood, without help. His eyes were very pale blue and very alert. He said, in a voice that was thin but steady, "Show me." Florence took the deed out of the manila envelope and held it out for him. Reuben took it in his left hand. He held it under the lamp beside his chair. He read it. He turned it over and ran his thumb along the wax seal at the bottom. He read his own signature, which appeared on it in a much firmer hand than the one he had now. He nodded once. He handed the deed back to Florence. "Hazel's girl," he said. "You look like her in the mouth. Mouth. Same chin. I'm sorry I never met you when you were small." "I'm sorry too, Mr. Halsey." "Reuben. Call me Reuben. Sit down. Both of you. All three of you, including the baby. Augusta, you sit too. I am going to tell this once. I have been waiting 55 years to tell it, and I would like to get it done in one go." Florence sat down on the edge of the bed. Augusta sat in the visitor's chair by the door. Idris sat in the other chair by the window. Wren was awake in the carrier on Florence's chest, watching the lamp. Reuben took a breath. His chest rose under the flannel shirt and fell again. He said, "My father's name was Reuben Halsey, Sr. He died in 1968. He was a hard man. He was a man who took what he could take when nobody was looking, and he hid the taking under the appearance of being respectable. In 1939, the year your great-grandfather Pomeroy Quintrell died, my father went to Pomeroy's house with a piece of paper that Pomeroy was too sick to read carefully, and he had Pomeroy sign over a strongbox that had been in your family for 90 years. Pomeroy died 11 days later. The strongbox went into my father's possession and from there into the back room of this mill, which my father owned at that time. Although the mill had been idle for almost a decade, and my father used it only as a place to keep things he did not want to keep in his own house. Inside the strongbox were my father's reasons for taking it. I will not describe those reasons in detail to you today, Florence, because they are in the letters your grandmother wrote to your mother, and you should read those letters first in your own time. The short version is that the contents of that strongbox were the savings of 3 generations of your family, and they were not small." He paused. He took another breath. He looked down at his hands on the arms of the recliner for a long moment, as if he were considering whether what he was about to say was something he had the right to say. Then he looked back up. "Your great-grandfather Pomeroy came over from County Cork in 1898 with $11 in his pocket. His own father had been a smith. Pomeroy was a stonemason. He worked on the Ashokan Reservoir from 1907 to 1915. Every summer he could get hired, which was most of them, and he saved. He sent for his wife in 1906, and they had 8 children, of whom 4 survived to grow up, of whom your grandmother Hazel's father Reginald was the youngest. The strongbox was Pomeroy's, and then it was Reginald's, and Reginald married a woman named Tabitha, who had been a schoolteacher in Catskill before the marriage. Tabitha was a careful woman. Tabitha did the household accounts, and she added to the strongbox what she could add, which was more than her husband knew, because Tabitha had been saving from her own salary before the marriage and had not seen any reason to mention it. When Reginald died in 1939, the strongbox passed to Tabitha, who passed it the same year to Hazel, who was 12. Hazel kept the key for 32 years. My father had the box. Hazel had the key. Neither one of them could do anything with what was in there without the other." Reuben paused again. He looked at Florence. "My father never opened the strongbox. He did not have the key. The key had been kept by Pomeroy's wife Tabitha, who was your great-grandmother, and Tabitha had hidden it from my father when my father came to the house. Tabitha gave it to Hazel, who was 12 years old at the time. Hazel kept it. Hazel kept it for 32 years. In 1971, when my father had been dead for 3 years and I had inherited the mill and the lumberyard and a number of other things I was not proud of, your grandmother came to my office at the lumberyard and laid the key on my desk. She told me what was in the strongbox in the back room of the mill. She told me how it had got there. She told me, in a voice that I will not forget if I live to 100, that she did not intend to make my children pay for what my father had done, but that she also did not intend to walk away from what was hers. She offered me $1 for the mill. I gave her the deed. I gave her the key to the back room. I have kept a copy of that key in the same desk drawer in my house ever since, in a wooden box, behind a stack of envelopes, exactly where Hazel told me to keep it. When I moved into this room 3 years ago, I brought the box with me. The box is in the top drawer of that dresser there. The key is inside it. The key is yours, Florence. It has been yours since the day you were born. Hazel asked me to remember that, also. Reuben pointed at the dresser by the wall. Florence could not move. Augusta got up. Augusta walked to the dresser, opened the top drawer, and took out a small wooden box about the size of a deck of cards. Augusta carried the box to Florence and put it in Florence's lap. Florence opened the box. Inside, on a small piece of dark blue velvet, lay an old iron key, dark with age, about 3 inches long, with a wide head and a simple straight bit. It was the kind of key that opened a padlock from the same era as the one on the back door of the mill. Reuben said, "Florence, look at me." Florence looked at him. "I am going to tell you one more thing. The contents of that strongbox were your family's. Not mine. Not my father's. Yours. Your grandmother spent 44 years adding to them because she believed in keeping what was hers and in building on it. She did not collect those things for herself. She did not need them for herself. She collected them for whoever in your family would one day need them. That was her belief. I am telling you this so that you will not feel, when you open that door, that you are taking anything that anybody gave you out of kindness. You are taking back what was already yours. Do you understand?" "I understand," Florence said. "Good," Reuben said. "Now go. And Florence, one last thing. There will be people in the next few weeks who will try to tell you that what is in that trunk does not belong to you. There will be people who will try to tell you that the deed is not valid, or that the chain of title is broken, or that Hazel did not have the right to leave the contents to you. Those people will be wrong. The deed is valid. The chain is clean. I have spoken to my own lawyer about this every 5 years for the last 55 years, because I wanted to know, and because Hazel wanted me to know. My lawyer is a man named Wendell Breyer. He has an office on the 2nd floor above the pharmacy on Main Street, 2 doors down from Augusta's diner. Wendell knows everything I have just told you. Wendell has a file. Wendell has been waiting for you for 30 years. Augusta knows him. Augusta will take you tomorrow. Wendell will be your lawyer for this, not Pilar Esmer, because Pilar is a fine woman, but Pilar does estate work for poor families, and Pilar is not who you need now. Wendell does property work. Wendell did your grandmother's work for 50 years. Wendell will not charge you anything until the matter is concluded, and when it is concluded, his fee will be reasonable, and it will be the only fee that anybody touches before you do. I am telling you this so that you do not have to think about it. The lawyer is arranged. The lawyer was arranged a long time ago. Tomorrow morning at 9. Augusta will drive you. Augusta knows." Augusta nodded once from the chair by the door. "I know." Florence stood. She had to hold the small wooden box with both hands to keep from dropping it. She walked over to Reuben in the recliner and bent down and kissed him on his cheek, very lightly. Reuben did not move. His eyes were wet, but he did not let the wet leave his eyes. He patted her hand once with his own hand, and then let her go. "Florence," he said, "Hazel would have been proud of you. I think you should know that. She told me once. She said, 'My granddaughter Florence is the one. She is the one this is for. She is the one who is going to need it.' Hazel said that to me in 2014, sitting in that chair right there. She was right. I have been waiting for you." Florence walked out of Reuben's room without trusting her voice. Augusta walked beside her. Idris was waiting in the corridor with his hat in his hands. Idris did not ask. Idris had been a librarian for 60 years, and he had learned a long time ago what kinds of moments did not need a question put to them. They drove back to the mill in the late afternoon. The sun was already low over the western hills. Augusta drove. Florence sat in the passenger seat with the small wooden box on her lap and the iron key inside it. Wren slept in the carrier against her chest. Idris had stayed in town. Idris had said this part was hers. Idris had also said, gently, that he would be at the Historical Society building on Saturday if Florence wanted to look at any of the public records on the mill, and that the Historical Society had a complete run of the Carthridge Hollow Sentinel from 1865 to 1998, and that there were articles in those papers that Florence might find interesting once she had read the letters. Idris had said all of this in the voice of a librarian who had been doing this work for 60 years and knew exactly how much information to give a person at any one time. The fire road in the late afternoon looked different from the fire road in the morning. The light came through the hemlocks in long copper bars. The leaves on the road were dry now, and the Subaru's tires hissed as they rolled over them. Florence held the key in her hand inside the box and did not look down. When they pulled into the clearing, the mill stood in the same place it had stood the day before and the day before that, and for 210 years before that. Florence got out of the car. She unlocked the new padlock on the front door with the new silver key. She lit the propane lantern Augusta had left inside on the workbench. She carried the lantern across the main floor to the back door. The light from the lantern filled the room more evenly than the daylight from the front door had. The shadows fell differently. The cabinet of ledgers looked taller. The cast iron stove threw a long bar of shadow across the stone floor. Florence knelt in front of the back door. She set the lantern down beside her. She took the iron key out of the wooden box. She put the key in the padlock. The padlock was heavy and old, and the key was heavy and old, and the two fit together with a satisfaction that was almost a sound. She turned the key. The padlock opened. She lifted it off the hasp and set it on the floor beside the lantern. She pulled the back door open. The room behind it was smaller than the main floor. The walls were stone. There was no window. The ceiling was lower. The air inside was perhaps 5 degrees colder still. Against the far wall, set on a low wooden platform that lifted it about 6 inches off the stone floor, was a metal trunk. The trunk was painted dark green. The trunk had iron bands across the top and the sides. The trunk had a single padlock on the front, a small one, much newer than the one on the door. The trunk was about the size of a large suitcase. The trunk had Florence's grandmother's initials painted on the lid in white, the letters H, M, Q, in a hand so steady and careful that Florence understood Hazel had painted them herself. The room was empty of everything else. The stone walls had no shelves. The floor had no rug. There was no chair, no table, no other furniture. Hazel had built the room for the trunk and the trunk only, the way a person builds a vault for one specific thing. The platform under the trunk was made of cedar. Florence could tell by the color and grain, even in the lantern light, cut and joined neatly to keep the metal of the trunk away from any damp that might come up through the stone. The cedar had been treated and oiled. Even the platform had been built to last. Florence stood in the doorway holding the lantern. Augusta had come up behind her and was standing in the main room, not crossing the threshold, because Augusta understood that this part was not hers. Florence stepped into the small room. She set the lantern on the platform beside the trunk. She looked at the small padlock. She looked back at Augusta. Augusta nodded once, slowly. Florence looked into the wooden box that Reuben Halsey had given her. Beneath the velvet on which the iron key had lain, folded once down the middle, was a second piece of paper she had not seen at first. She lifted it out. The paper was a hand-drawn diagram. The diagram showed the backroom of the mill. The diagram showed the trunk. Next to the trunk, the diagram showed an arrow pointing at the small padlock and a note in Hazel's handwriting that read, "Combination, June 22nd, 71. The day." The padlock on the trunk was a combination padlock, not a key padlock. Florence had not noticed. She knelt in front of the trunk. She turned the small dial. 6:22:71. The day her grandmother had paid Reuben Halsey $1 for the mill. The day everything began. The padlock clicked. The shackle lifted. Florence put her hand on the lid of the trunk. The iron banding was cold against her palm. She could feel her own pulse in her throat. Behind her, very quietly, Augusta said, "Take your time, sweetheart." Florence did not take her time. She had been taking her time for 4 months. She had been taking her time, in some larger sense, for the entire 34 years of her life. She had been raised by a mother and a grandmother who had taken their time about everything that mattered, and the taking of time had been the thing that almost let Desmond Halvorsen walk away with every piece of paper she had ever signed. She had decided sometime in the last hour that she was finished with taking her time. She lifted the lid. The first thing she saw was the cloth. The trunk had been lined, top and bottom and sides, with heavy unbleached muslin that had once been white and had aged to the color of strong tea. The muslin was layered in 3 thicknesses against the inside walls, and a single folded sheet of it lay across the contents like a sheet across a sleeping body. Florence held the lid open with one hand and lifted the muslin with the other. The cloth was clean. There was no dust on it. There was no smell of anything but cedar and old cotton. Beneath the muslin, the trunk had been organized in compartments. Hazel had built or bought a fitted tray that sat in the upper half of the trunk, with 12 square pockets in 3 rows of 4. Each pocket was lined in dark blue velvet. Each pocket held a coin. Florence counted them with her eyes before she touched any of them. 12 coins in the upper tray. Below the tray, when she lifted it carefully out by 2 small leather loops at the ends, was a second tray of the same dimensions. Another 12 pockets. Another 12 coins. Beneath the second tray was a third. Beneath the third tray was a fourth. Each tray held 12 coins. Beneath the fourth tray was the bottom of the trunk, and the bottom of the trunk was not bare. The bottom of the trunk held a series of cloth bundles, each tied with the same dark blue ribbon, and beneath the bundles, lying flat against the cedar floor of the trunk, was a leather portfolio. The portfolio was thick. The portfolio was old. Florence did not pick anything up yet. She knelt on the stone floor of the back room with the lantern at her side, and she looked into the trunk for a long time, and she let her eyes move from one tray to the next, from one bundle to the next, and she did not touch. 48 coins, she counted, 12 in each of 4 trays. She lifted the first coin from the top tray. It was a heavy gold piece, about an inch in diameter, slightly worn at the edges. She held it under the lantern. The obverse showed a woman's profile facing left, with the word Liberty across the headband. The reverse showed an eagle in flight. The date was 1907. The bottom edge of the obverse, when she turned it carefully, was inscribed in tiny raised letters, St. Gaudens. Florence had read enough at the dentist's office during slow afternoons to know what she was holding. A 1907 St. Gaudens double eagle. She did not know what one was worth. She knew that it was worth more than nothing. She set it carefully back in its velvet pocket and lifted out the second coin, and the third, and the fourth. She did this without speaking. Augusta had come in behind her at some point and was standing in the doorway holding the propane lantern up so that the light fell more evenly across the trunk. Augusta was breathing very slowly. Florence understood that Augusta did not want to breathe loudly enough to disturb anything. By the time Florence had inventoried the top tray, her hands were trembling badly enough that she had to set the last coin down before she dropped it. She sat back on her heels. "Augusta," she said. "Yes, sweetheart. I think I need to stop counting for a minute." "Take your time." Florence put both her hands flat against the stone floor on either side of her knees. She breathed in. She breathed out. Wren, somewhere on the other side of the wall, made a small wet noise that was the sound a baby makes in her sleep when she is dreaming about something pleasant. Florence kept her hands flat on the floor and listened to her daughter dream. After a few minutes, she stood up. Her knees ached. She walked back into the main room and looked at the cabinet of ledgers. She walked to the cabinet. She took down the 2015 ledger, the last one Hazel had kept. She opened it to the back page. The final entry, in Hazel's weakened handwriting from November of that year, said, "Stopped collecting. Tired." Below that, in pencil, in a hand that was even weaker, was a note Florence had not seen the day before because she had closed the book too quickly. The note read, "Total inventory. See inside back cover." Florence opened the inside back cover. There was a folded piece of paper tucked into the cardboard pocket of the binding. She unfolded it. The paper was a single sheet, typed on the Smith Corona upstairs, with Hazel's correcting pencil marks in the margins. At the top, in Hazel's hand, Bramley Mill. Final inventory. October 2015. Below it was a list. 48 numismatic coins, by date and mint mark, with a column of estimated values in 2015 dollars. 11 pieces of antique silver, by maker and pattern, with another column of values. 7 pieces of antique jewelry, by description. 3 early American pocket watches. 22 pieces of cut and rough gemstones. A small inventory of antiquarian documents, including a colonial-era land patent. And at the bottom of the page, in Hazel's hand, Pomeroy strongbox, contents undisturbed since 1939. Approximate value of strongbox contents, unknown. Approximate value of mill collection, $1,840,000. Florence stared at the number for a long moment. She did not feel anything specific. She felt the muffled, distant feeling a person feels in the first seconds after a car accident, when the body has not yet reported back on what has happened to it. Augusta had come up behind her and was reading over her shoulder. "Augusta," Florence said, "there's a strongbox." "I heard Reuben say, there's a strongbox we have not opened yet. It's at the bottom of the trunk, or beside the trunk." Reuben said it was the savings of 3 generations. He said it had not been opened since 1939. "Florence, baby, sit down." "I don't want to sit down. I want to see what's in it." "All right, then we will go and see." Florence walked back into the small back room. The trunk was open. The 4 trays of coins were lifted out and stacked carefully on the muslin she had laid down to receive them. The cloth bundles were still inside. The leather portfolio was still at the bottom. And on the cedar platform beside the trunk, which she had not seen at first because the platform extended further than the trunk did and the lantern shadow had hidden it, was a low square shape draped in a second piece of heavier muslin. Florence had walked past it without seeing it. She pulled the muslin off. The Pomeroy strongbox was made of black iron with brass fittings at the corners. It was about 18 inches square and a foot deep. It had a single hinged lid with a heavy hasp and a keyhole. The lock had been polished within the last decade. Florence could tell by the shine on the brass. The iron of the box itself was dark and pitted, the way iron of that age becomes, but it had been oiled. The key Hazel had kept for 32 years was the key for this box. The iron key Reuben had given Florence in the wooden box was the key for the door of the room. The key for the strongbox was somewhere else. Florence stood very still. She could not see another wooden box. She could not see a third hiding place. Then she looked up at the platform under the trunk. Hazel's hand-drawn diagram had shown an arrow pointing at the platform itself. Florence had assumed the arrow pointed at the cedar wood. The diagram had been more specific than that. Florence knelt down. She ran her fingers along the underside of the platform. There was a small wooden block fastened to the underside, near the back. The block was a drawer. She slid it open. Inside the drawer was a brass key on a brass chain. She took the key out. The key fit the lock on the strongbox. She turned it. The lock had not been oiled as recently as the hinges, and it resisted for a moment, but it gave. The lid was heavy. She had to lift it with both hands. The strongbox was lined with leather instead of muslin, leather that had been treated and re-blackened more than once over the long years. Inside were 3 rolled bundles of canvas, each about a foot long and 4 inches thick, tied with leather thongs. Beneath the canvas bundles were 2 flat envelopes of waxed paper. Beneath the waxed paper envelopes was a single oilskin pouch, dark with age, that fitted the width of the box. Florence lifted out the first canvas bundle. The leather thongs were brittle, but they held when she untied them. The canvas unrolled. Inside, lying in a line along the unrolled canvas, were 28 gold coins. They were not American. They were Spanish, with the bust of a king Florence did not recognize and Latin inscriptions she could not read. Each was about the size of a $50. Each was thick and heavy. The metal was bright. Florence rolled the canvas back up carefully. She tied the thongs. She set the bundle on the cedar platform beside the trunk. She did not yet pick up the second bundle. She closed her eyes for a moment. "Augusta," she said, "I think we need to call Wendell Breyer tonight. Not tomorrow morning. Tonight. He will not mind. I think we need to lock everything back exactly the way Hazel left it. And we need to leave this room exactly the way we found it. And we need to drive back into town tonight. And we need to be in Wendell Breyer's office at 8 in the morning. We need to do this very carefully. We need a chain of custody. We need a notary. We need photographs. We need somebody official to be present every time this trunk is opened from now on, including tonight, and I think Wendell will know who that person is." "Yes, sweetheart. That is exactly right." Florence closed the strongbox. She turned the key. She put the key back in the small drawer under the platform. She slid the drawer closed. She replaced the heavy muslin over the strongbox. She put the trays of coins back into the trunk in the order she had taken them out. She laid the inner muslin sheet across the top. She closed the lid of the trunk. She turned the combination dial back to 0. She backed out of the back room with the lantern. She closed the green door. She locked the heavy padlock with the iron key. She put the iron key in the small wooden box. She put the wooden box in her tote bag, on top of the bundle of letters from Hazel to Marigold, on top of the 1971 ledger, on top of the deed. She closed the front door of the mill behind them. She locked the new silver padlock with the new silver key. She put the key in the inside zipper pocket of her tote bag. She walked back to the Subaru. Augusta drove. Wren slept against Florence's chest the whole way back into town. Florence did not speak. She did not need to. Augusta did not turn on the radio. Wendell Breyer lived on the second floor of his office building, in an apartment that had been carved out of the original 1890 building when his father had bought the property in 1956. Wendell was 74. He had been a lawyer for 49 of those years. He came to the door in a flannel robe over his trousers and a cardigan over the robe, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead exactly the way Pilar Esmer wore hers. And he looked at Florence on his doorstep, and he looked at Augusta beside her, and he said, "Hazel's girl." "Yes, sir. You have something with you." "Yes, sir. Come in. Both of you. Bring the baby. Edith is asleep, but Edith will be glad to know you're here when she wakes up." He led them into the front room of the apartment. The room had been a lawyer's parlor before it had been an apartment, and it still had a partner's desk against one wall and a wall of legal books against another. Wendell did not turn on the overhead light. He turned on a green-shaded lamp on the desk. He sat down behind the desk and gestured for Florence and Augusta to sit in the two leather chairs across from him. He folded his hands on the desk blotter. He waited. Florence told him everything. She started with the hospital. She did not edit. She did not condense. She talked for 40 minutes. Wendell listened without interrupting. When she was done, he sat very still for a long moment, and then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a manila file folder that was about 2 inches thick. "Florence," he said, "I have been preparing this file since 1991. I added to it every year. Your grandmother and I had an arrangement. She paid me a retainer of $100 every January for 34 years to keep this file current and to be available to you on the day you came to ask for it. The retainer was $100 in 1991, and it was $100 in 2015, because Hazel believed that the value of the work I was doing for her did not change, and that adjusting for inflation would have been a kind of dishonesty between us. I want you to know that. She paid me $3,400 over 34 years to be your lawyer on this day. The last $100 check is dated December 2014. It cleared. I have it in the file. I have continued the work since then on the assumption that you would come." He pushed the file across the desk to her. "Inside the file," he said, "is everything. The chain of title on the mill, certified copies, 3 separate notarizations, a full text of your grandmother's will, the provisions in your grandmother's will that specifically address the contents of the mill by reference to her ledgers, and that designate you as the sole beneficiary of those contents, dated 2009. A trust instrument that your grandmother executed in 1994 placing the mill and its contents in a revocable family trust, of which you are now the sole trustee and sole beneficiary as of her death in 2015. The trust was not part of the public probate. The trust was not represented to Calvin Halvorsen by Hazel's executor, because the executor was me, and the executor did not know that Calvin Halvorsen had any interest in the matter. The cottage on Lindenhurst that you sold in 2017 was the only asset that passed through public probate. The cottage was always meant to be the visible inheritance. The trust was always meant to be the invisible one. Your grandmother set it up this way on purpose, Florence. She set it up because she had been a married woman whose husband walked out, and she knew what husbands could take when they decided to take. She built the trust to be untouchable by anyone outside the direct female line of her family. She built it in 1994, which is the year, if I may say so, that your mother divorced your father, and the year that your grandmother began to understand that any inheritance she left in plain sight was vulnerable. The mill is yours. The contents of the mill are yours. Your husband has no claim on either." Florence sat in the leather chair with her hand on the file folder. She did not open it yet. She said, "Mr. Breyer." "Wendell, please." "Wendell." "There was a strongbox in the back room. Reuben told me. It has been closed since 1939. There are gold coins in it. Spanish gold coins. I think they are very old. I think there are a lot of them. And I think there are documents." Wendell was very still for a moment. Then he opened the file, near the back, and turned to a page that Florence could not read upside down. He read it. He nodded once. "Your grandmother's note from 1994, he said, when she set up the trust. She wrote, 'Pomeroy strongbox to be inventoried by a qualified numismatist and antiquities specialist upon delivery to my heir.' I have not opened it. I do not intend to. Whatever is in it is what was left to me, and it is for whoever comes after me to handle. Florence, we are going to call Eugenia Tarbell at 8 tomorrow morning. Eugenia is a numismatist and a specialist in early colonial Spanish gold. She works out of Albany. Eugenia handled an authentication for me in 2003 on an unrelated matter, and Eugenia is the person we need. I will arrange a chain of custody. I will arrange for the contents to be moved to a bank vault tomorrow afternoon. I will arrange for the appraisal to be conducted at the bank vault under the witness of myself, of Eugenia, and of a notary public. I will arrange all of this by phone tomorrow morning before 9. You will be here at 8. Augusta will bring you. You will bring the trunk and the strongbox in the back of Augusta's car. Yusuf will drive ahead of you and Yusuf will drive behind you, because I will arrange that also. By tomorrow evening, every item in the mill will be photographed, weighed, described, and locked in a bonded facility, and the only person with access will be you. By Friday, I will have filed the appropriate notices with the county and the appropriate motions to invalidate the quitclaim on the Brindle Lane house. By the end of next week, I expect to have a temporary restraining order against your husband and his brother, prohibiting them from coming within 100 yards of you, of the baby, of the mill, of this office, or of Augusta's diner. Do you understand what I am telling you? I understand. Florence, I want to say one more thing. I knew your grandmother for 51 years. I am not going to lose this matter. I am not going to lose any part of this matter. I want you to sleep tonight knowing that. Augusta will drive you back to the shelter, or you can stay with my wife and me, in the spare room, with the baby. Edith would love to have you. The bed is made. It has been made for 9 years. Florence cried then. She had not cried in front of Wendell yet. She did not cry loudly. She let the tears come and run, and she did not wipe them away, and Wendell sat behind his desk with his hands folded on the blotter and waited until she was finished. Augusta sat in the chair beside her with one hand on Florence's arm. Wren slept on Florence's chest. When she could speak again, Florence said, "We will stay tonight, if Edith doesn't mind." Edith does not mind. The numismatist's name was Eugenia Tarbell. She was a small, thin woman about 50, with gray hair in a knot and round wire-rimmed glasses. She arrived at the bank vault at 1 in the afternoon on Wednesday and worked in silence for almost 5 hours, with a notary public making notes, Wendell watching, and Florence at the other end of the table holding Wren in the carrier. Eugenia identified each coin in the 4 trays first. She used a jeweler's loupe and a small set of calipers and a tablet of reference photographs that she had brought with her. She set each coin aside in a small fitted box of her own as she finished with it. When she was done with the trays, she opened the canvas bundles from the strongbox, all 3 of them, and she identified those coins as well. She used a different reference for those. She wrote a long entry in her notebook for each one. Several times she stopped writing and looked up at Wendell and said something brief that Florence could not always follow. Wendell would nod. The notary would make a note. At 6 in the evening, Eugenia closed her notebook. She removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. She looked at Florence. "Mrs. Quintrell," she said, "I am going to tell you what is in front of me. I am going to give you my professional opinion. I am going to be conservative. The figure I give you will be a low-end estimate. The high-end estimate will be substantially higher. Do you want to hear this with the lawyer present and the notary present, or do you want to clear the room? Please tell me with everyone here." Eugenia nodded. She opened her notebook to the back page. She read from her own notes. "The 48 numismatic coins in your grandmother's collection are American gold and silver pieces ranging in date from 1854 to 1933. The collection is diverse, expertly curated, and in extraordinary condition. The 4 1907 high-relief St. Gaudens double eagles, the 3 1916 standing Liberty quarters in mint state, the 2 1893 S. Morgan silver dollars, and the 1804 Class $3 that I found in the 3rd tray, taken individually and conservatively, place the value of the 4-tray collection between $1,800,000 and $2,200,000. I would not be surprised at auction to see the $1,804 alone realize $300,000 to $400,000. Your grandmother bought it in 1987 for $9,000, according to her ledger. That was a fair price at the time. She had an eye." Eugenia paused. She turned the page. The 78 coins in the Pomeroy strongbox are 16th and 17th century Spanish colonial gold, mostly cobs, mostly from the New World mints at Mexico City, Lima, and Potosi. Several are exceptional. The collection appears to have been built between 1850 and 1898 by your great-great-grandfather, who I assume was the man who came over from Ireland with the $11. He had remarkable judgment for somebody whose stated profession was stonemason. The Spanish gold, conservatively, is worth between $900,000 and $1,100,000. The two waxed paper envelopes in the strongbox contain a colonial land patent dated 1758, granted by the colonial governor of New York to one Angus Quintrell, who I would presume to be your 6 times great-grandfather, conveying a parcel of land that I have not yet researched. There is also a parchment marriage contract dated 1763 with seals that look extremely interesting. I am not the right person to value those documents. I will recommend a specialist at Sotheby's. The oilskin pouch at the bottom of the strongbox contains 2 pieces of cut emerald, 3 pieces of cut sapphire, and what appears to my untrained eye to be 1 uncut diamond of approximately 12 carats. I am not a gemologist. I will recommend somebody. My initial estimate on the gemstones, again conservative, is between $400,000 and $700,000. The 11 pieces of antique silver from your grandmother's collection, which I am not the right person to value, but which I have photographed for the appraiser at Christie's I will be contacting tomorrow, look to me, by my untrained guess, to be worth between $300,000 and $400,000. The 7 pieces of jewelry I cannot value at all. The pocket watches are worth perhaps $30,000 to $50,000 together. Eugenia closed her notebook. She looked at Florence. Mrs. Quintrell, the conservative low-end estimate of everything I have personally examined today is $3.5 million. The high-end estimate, after additional appraisals on the silver and the gems and the documents, will likely be in the neighborhood of $5 million. The trust now contains, as a single inherited estate, between $3.5 and $5 million in liquid or near-liquid assets. I have never appraised a private collection of this depth that came out of a single family. I have done this work for 27 years. I have seen larger collections, but I have not seen one assembled with this much patience, by this many generations, with this much intention. She closed the notebook. She placed her hands flat on the table. That is my preliminary opinion, she said. We will have a written report by Friday. Florence sat with Wren against her chest and listened to her own breathing. She did not speak. She could not. Augusta had quietly taken her hand at some point during Eugenia's reading and was holding it. Wendell was watching Florence's face the way a doctor watches a patient. The notary had finished her notes and was waiting. Florence found her voice. She said, "Thank you, Miss Tarbell." "Eugenia." "Thank you, Eugenia." Eugenia nodded once and began to pack her things. That night Florence and Wren slept again in the spare room at Wendell and Edith's, in the brass bed that had been made up for them 9 years before, and Florence did not dream, and Wren slept 7 straight hours, and when Florence woke at 6 in the morning to feed her, the spring light was coming through the curtain and Edith was downstairs already, making oatmeal with raisins on the stove. Edith had been waiting 51 years, like Wendell, in her own way. Edith did not say so. Edith only made oatmeal. The week that followed was, in Wendell's word, procedural. The mill and its contents were inventoried, photographed, and recorded with the county on Wednesday. The motion to vacate the fraudulent quitclaim on the Brindle Lane house was filed in court on Thursday. Wendell's law clerk drove the paperwork to the county clerk's office personally. The notary at the clerk's office, who had been a friend of Hazel's, expedited the filing without being asked. By Friday afternoon, Calvin Halvorsen had received a hand-delivered notice that the deed transfer on 14 Brindle Lane had been challenged on the grounds of forged signature and would be subject to a hearing on the 28th of March. Calvin Halvorsen had also received a bar complaint citation regarding his unauthorized contact with Florence on Tuesday. Calvin's voicemail to Florence, transcribed and notarized, was attached as the principal exhibit. The hearing on the 28th was brief. Pell Ottinger, the notary at the UPS store franchise who had certified the forged quitclaim, did not appear. Pell Ottinger had not returned Calvin's calls all week. Pell Ottinger had also, it turned out, certified forged signatures on 3 other quitclaim deeds during the previous calendar year, 2 of which were unrelated to Calvin's practice and 1 of which was. The clerk of the court entered Pell Ottinger's certification record into evidence. Desmond Halvorsen did not appear. Desmond Halvorsen's attorney did not appear. Calvin Halvorsen's name was, by then, no longer attached to the matter because Calvin had been suspended pending review by the state bar. A new attorney had been substituted. The new attorney had been retained the previous Monday. The new attorney was the one who informed the court, in writing, that Mr. Halvorsen would not be opposing the motion. The judge vacated the quitclaim. The house on Brindle Lane was returned to Florence's sole ownership at 3:43 in the afternoon. The judge ordered Desmond to vacate the premises within 30 days. The judge also referred the matter of the forged signature and the matter of the $8,000 withdrawn from the joint account on the night of October 16th, and the matter of the contents of the marital home that had been disposed of without Florence's knowledge, to the district attorney for review. Florence saw Desmond once, after the hearing, before he went to Coxsackie. She did not arrange the meeting. She did not want it. It happened in the parking lot of the Stop and Shop on Route 9, on a Sunday afternoon in late April, while Florence was loading groceries into the trunk of the used Honda she had bought the previous week. He came across the parking lot toward her at a half-jog. He was thinner than she remembered. He had grown a beard, the color of old straw, and he had not trimmed it. He stopped about 6 feet away from the back of the car and put both his hands up flat in front of his chest, palms out, the way a person does when he wants you to understand that he is not coming any closer. "Florence," he said. She did not answer him. She finished putting the last bag of groceries in the trunk. She closed the trunk. She turned to face him with her keys in her hand. Wren was in the car seat in the back, asleep, with the windows up. Florence positioned her body so that she stood between Desmond and the driver's side door. "Florence, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to ask you for anything. I just want to say one thing. Then I will leave. I promise I will leave." "Desmond, the restraining order says you are not supposed to be within 100 yards of me." "I know. I will go. I just want to say one thing, and then I will go, and you will never have to see me again. Will you let me say one thing?" She did not answer. He took her silence as the answer he was going to get. "I'm sorry," he said. The word came out of his mouth the way a word comes out of a person who has rehearsed it for many hours and is still not certain how to say it. "I did what I did because Calvin told me what I could get if I did it, and I believed him. I was scared of the baby. I was scared of being a father. I let my brother make decisions for me that I should have made for myself. I'm not telling you this to make you feel anything. I'm telling you because I owe you the words." Florence looked at him, the man she had married 4 years and 8 months before. The man who had stood at the back of the room when she had pushed for 24 minutes and brought their daughter into the world. The man who had not come back from the parking garage. "Desmond," she said, "I don't want your sorry. I don't want anything from you. I want you to leave this parking lot and never come within 100 yards of me again. That is the only thing I will accept from you. Do you understand?" "I understand. Go." He turned and walked back across the parking lot to a small car she did not recognize. She watched him get into the driver's seat. She watched him start the engine. She watched him pull out of the lot and turn south onto Route 9. She did not get into her own car until his taillights had disappeared. Then she got in. She sat in the driver's seat for a long moment with her hands on the steering wheel. In the back seat, Wren slept on, undisturbed. Florence put the key in the ignition. She drove home. She did not tell anyone about the conversation in the parking lot for almost a year. When she did, it was to Augusta, late one evening at the mill, sitting on the wooden step where she would later sit with Wren. Augusta listened. Augusta only said, "He was a small man, sweetheart, and he got smaller. There's nothing in that for you to carry. You let it go." Florence did. She had already, in some part of her, the moment she watched the taillights turn south. Florence did not move back into the house on Brindle Lane. She did not want to. The house had been a place where she had been deceived, and she did not want to wake up in it. She listed the house with a real estate agent, and she sold it within a month for $241,000 to a young couple from Yonkers who had a 4-year-old daughter and who fell in love with the wraparound porch. Florence used part of the proceeds to buy a small brick house on Tulip Street, 3 doors down from Idris and Cleotha Whitcomb, with a fenced yard and a sunroom that faced east. She and Wren moved in on the 2nd of May, 2026. The legal aftermath continued, in the background, for almost a year. Desmond Halvorsen pled to 2 felony counts and 1 misdemeanor. He served 18 months at the state facility in Coxsackie. He was ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $43,000 for the conversion of marital assets, plus the $8,000 from the joint account, plus court costs. He did not contest the divorce. He waived custody of Wren. He did not, in the entire proceeding, send Florence a personal communication, and Florence did not request one. Calvin Halvorsen was suspended from the practice of law for a period of 2 years. After his reinstatement, His caseload was substantially diminished, and he moved to a different county. Florence read Hazel's letters slowly. She read one a week, in the evenings, after Wren was asleep, sitting in the chair by the window in the sunroom of the new house on Tulip Street. She did not rush them. The first letter, dated the 8th of November, 1972, began, "Marigold. You will not want to read this, and I do not blame you, but I am going to write it anyway, and I am going to keep writing them until you read one. There is something I owe you an explanation for, and there are some things I owe your daughter, who you do not have yet, but who I know will come." The letters were the story of how Hazel had handled the strongbox. They were also the story of how Hazel had handled her marriage and her divorce in everything but paper, and her decision in 1971 to take back what Reuben Halsey Sr. had stolen from her family. They were the story of how Hazel had decided not to tell Marigold any of it until Marigold was older, and then, when Marigold was old enough, the story of how Marigold had refused to hear it. They were the story of a particular kind of estrangement between a mother and a daughter, which Florence had inherited the shape of without ever understanding what it had been about. Marigold had not refused the letters because she did not love her mother. Marigold had refused the letters because Marigold believed her mother had done wrong by taking the mill from Reuben, and because Marigold believed that the contents of the strongbox should be returned to whoever the descendants of Pomeroy's 8 surviving Irish cousins might now be, and because Marigold had been a particular kind of moral person who could not be argued with on this point, even when the argument was made carefully and patiently across 31 letters over 19 years. Hazel had not won her daughter back. Hazel had decided, instead, to wait for the next generation. The 31st letter, dated October 1991, ended, "I am not going to write again. You have made your choice, and I have made mine. I love you, and I will love you until I die. If your daughter ever asks, she should be told that I love her too, and that what I have built for her. Hazel." The 17th letter, dated March of 1981, was the one Florence kept coming back to. It was the longest of the letters. It was 4 pages of single-spaced Smith Corona typing on the cream-colored paper Hazel had used for 30 years. In it, Hazel described in detail the morning in 1939 when Reuben Halsey Sr. had come to the Quintrell house with a piece of paper. Hazel had been 12. She had been sitting on the staircase when the visit took place. She had heard everything. Her father Reginald had been 3 days from dying and could not raise his head off the pillow, and Reuben Sr. had stood beside the bed and spoken to him in a voice that was patient and kind and dishonest. Reuben Sr. had said the strongbox would be safer at the mill. Reuben Sr. had said the family was vulnerable now that Reginald could not protect them. Reuben Sr. had said he was happy to help. Reginald had signed the paper because he had not been able to read it, and because Reuben Sr. had been his oldest friend's son, and because in 1939 in Carthridge Hollow you did not refuse a man who came to your sickbed offering help. Hazel had watched her mother Tabitha walk Reuben Sr. to the door. Hazel had watched her mother smile at him as he left. Hazel had watched her mother close the door behind him and lean her forehead against the wood for a long minute without moving. Hazel had then watched her mother walk back upstairs to the bedroom, past Hazel on the staircase, without speaking. An hour later Tabitha had come back down and put on her coat and walked the 4 blocks to the post office and mailed a letter to Reuben Sr. with a key inside it. The letter had been short. The letter had said the key in the envelope was the key to the strongbox, and that he was welcome to use it if he wished, but that if he ever did open the box, every man in Carthridge Hollow would know within a week what was inside, and that knowing what was inside would be the end of the Halsey family's standing in the county, because the contents of the box were not the kind of contents a man could ever explain having come by honestly. The letter had ended. "I trust this resolves the question of safekeeping to your satisfaction. T. Quintrell." The key in the envelope had been a key Tabitha had made from a candle wax impression and a brass blank. It did not fit the strongbox. It did not fit any lock on the property. It was a decoy. The real key had been in Tabitha's apron pocket the entire time Reuben Sr. had been in the house, and Tabitha had passed it to Hazel that evening, sitting on the edge of Hazel's bed, with no explanation other than that Hazel should keep it on a chain around her neck and never take it off, and that one day Hazel would understand why. Florence read this letter 3 times. She read it once on a Tuesday evening in mid-July, and then she read it again the following Tuesday, and then she read it a third time in the first week of August. The third time, she sat in the sunroom for almost an hour afterward without moving. She thought about her great-grandmother Tabitha, whom she had never met, who had died in 1958, 34 years before Florence was born. Tabitha had been a schoolteacher. Tabitha had grown roses. Tabitha had outlived her husband by 19 years and had not remarried. Florence had thought she knew everything she needed to know about Tabitha, which had been that Tabitha was the great-grandmother on the wall in the cream-colored photograph in the hallway of Hazel's cottage, the woman with the high collar and the small, careful smile. Florence had not known that Tabitha had stood at her own front door and smiled at Reuben Halsey Sr. and walked 4 blocks to the post office to send him a decoy key in a letter that ended a chapter of his family's history on a single sheet of writing paper. Florence had not known that the women in her family did this kind of work. She had not known that the work she was now doing was the same work for generations on. In late August, she drove out to the cemetery in Carthridge Hollow with a bunch of marigolds in the back seat and a single peach-colored rose she had cut from a bush in the new yard on Tulip Street. She put the marigolds on her mother's grave. She put the rose on Tabitha's grave, 3 rows over, where the older Quintrells were buried. She stood for a long time between the 2 stones. Wren was at home with Cleotha. A bumblebee moved between the marigolds. Florence did not say anything out loud. She put her hand briefly on the top of each stone, and then she got back in the car and drove home. She decided that night, in the sunroom, what she was going to do with the inheritance. The Hazel Quintrell Trust for Women in Property Recovery was incorporated as a nonprofit in the state of New York on the 17th of August, 2026, with Wendell Breyer as its initial attorney of record and Florence as its founding director. Its mission was to provide free legal services, emergency housing, and asset recovery assistance to women whose husbands or partners had unlawfully taken or alienated marital or personal property from them. Its initial endowment, after the silver and the documents and the gems had all been valued, and after Wendell had taken his fee of $11,000 for almost a year of full-time work, was $4,812,000. The trust hired its first staff attorney in October. It hired its second in January. By the end of its first year, the trust had taken on 41 cases. Pilar Esmer was the trust's first staff attorney. Pilar had 147 open files when Florence called her, and Pilar reduced her caseload to the trust's cases over a period of 3 months, and Pilar's paralegal, a woman named Beulah, came with her. Aurelia from the shelter was the trust's first housing coordinator. Vesta from the shelter became the trust's first emergency intake specialist. Augusta was the trust's first board member. Idris was the second. Cleotha was the third. Reuben Halsey was the fourth, and Reuben served until he died in February of 2027 at the age of 92, in his sleep, in the recliner by the window at the assisted living, with a paperback novel open on his lap. Florence gave the eulogy at his funeral. Wren slept against her chest the entire service. The mill at the end of the fire road off Route 213 was not sold. Florence had Wendell's office add a clause to the trust documents stipulating that the mill could never be sold and could never be developed. The 23.4 acres of woodland around it were placed in a conservation easement with a local land trust the following spring. The mill itself was restored, very slowly, over the course of 2 years, by a small crew of local craftsmen who had been chosen by Augusta and approved by Wendell. The exterior stone was repointed. The water wheel was rebuilt. The boards were taken off the upper windows. The cabinet of ledgers was preserved. The Smith Corona Galaxy 12 was left exactly where Hazel had left it, with the unfinished letter still in the platen. The strongbox was kept at the mill in its original position, now empty, on its cedar platform. The green metal trunk was kept beside it. Both lids were closed but not locked. The combination padlock and the iron key hung from a small wooden peg on the wall above the trunk. Florence had decided that anyone who visited the mill should be able to see, without having to break anything, what had been there. She brought Wren to the mill for the first overnight visit in October of 2027, when Wren was a year and 4 months old. The cot had been remattressed. The cast-iron stove still worked. Florence and Wren slept side by side in the cot under the wool army blanket. In the morning, Wren woke up and pulled herself up to the windowsill, the new clear glass of the window having been installed by then, and she stood there for a long time looking out at the creek running fast over the rocks. She did not say anything because she could not yet talk. She just looked. Florence watched her from the cot. Wren had Hazel's mouth. Wren had Florence's eyes. Wren had her own light. 3 years later, on a clear, cold morning in March of 2029, Florence Quintrell sat on the wooden step of the front door of Bramley Mill with her daughter beside her. Wren was 4. Wren could now talk, and now did, all the time, about everything she saw. Wren had a small spiral-bound notebook in her lap and a thick pencil, and she was drawing a picture of the creek. Florence had a cup of coffee in her hand and a folded piece of paper in her coat pocket. The piece of paper was the latest report from the trust. The trust had served 498 women in its first 3 years. The trust had recovered $16 million in fraudulently transferred property. Pilar Esmer had been promoted to executive director the previous fall. Florence had stepped back to the role of board chair so that she could spend more time at the mill with Wren. Augusta was inside the mill making breakfast on the cast-iron stove. Augusta came out every other month on weekends to stay at the mill with Florence and Wren, in a small room she had built for herself in the loft. Idris Whitcomb had died the previous August, at 86, peacefully, with Cleotha holding his hand. Idris had left the Historical Society his entire research file on the mill, with instructions to publish a small monograph in the spring. The monograph was titled The Bramley Mill and the Quintrell Women, 1758 to 2026, and it was being typeset by a small press in Kingston, and Florence had read the proofs the week before. Wren looked up from her drawing. "Mama," she said, "who built this house?" "The mill, you mean?" "Yes, the mill. A man named Bramley built the first version of it in 1816. He was a miller. Then a family named Halsey owned it for a long time. Then your great-grandmother Hazel bought it in 1971 for $1. Then she left it to me. And now it's ours. For $1. For $1. Wren considered this. That's not a lot of money. No, it isn't. But it was the right amount. It was the amount that meant something. "Mama." "Yes. When I grow up, can I have it?" Florence put her hand on top of Wren's small head, on the dark hair that was already curling the way Florence's hair had curled when she was small. The morning sun was on her daughter's face. The creek ran fast over the rocks behind the mill. Somewhere up in the hemlocks a woodpecker was working. The smell of bacon was coming through the open door from Augusta's stove. "Yes," Florence said. "When you grow up, it will be yours. That's how it works in our family. We keep what's ours, and we build on it, and we pass it down. That's the whole point." Wren went back to her drawing. After a moment she said, "What am I going to give to my baby?" "Whatever you decide to. Whatever you want to. You will have a long time to decide. Hazel had 44 years to decide what she would give to me. I will have a long time to decide what I will give to you. You will have a long time to decide what you will give to whoever comes after you. There is no hurry, sweetheart. We have time." Wren nodded the serious little nod of a 4-year-old who has just learned something she will remember when she is 40. She bent back over her drawing. The pencil moved on the paper. The creek made its steady sound. Florence drank her coffee. The sun moved a little higher above the hemlocks. She thought about Hazel coming up this same fire road in a Ford pickup in 1971, with $1 in her pocket and a key in her purse, and she thought about the woman Hazel had been and the woman Hazel had built this whole long, quiet building to make possible. Florence understood, sitting on the wooden step in the March sunlight, that she was that woman now. The waiting was over. The work was hers. Behind her, in the workshop where she had stood 3 years before with a propane lantern in her hand, she could hear Augusta calling Wren's name. Breakfast was ready. The day was beginning. Wren got up off the step with her notebook in one hand and her pencil in the other, and she ran inside without looking back, the way children run into rooms where they know they will be loved. Florence stayed on the step a moment longer. She watched the creek. She held her coffee. She listened to her daughter's voice carrying out through the open door of the mill her grandmother had paid $1 for in 1971, the mill her great-great-grandfather Pomeroy had not known existed when he had come over from County Cork in 1898 with $11 in his pocket, the mill that was now hers and would one day be Wren's, and would one day after that be Wren's daughter's if Wren ever had one. And she thought about the long, careful work of women in her family across more than 120 years, and she thought about how that work had finally reached her in a manila envelope at the bottom of a cardboard box in a storage unit in Kingston on a Saturday morning in March, when she had been eating saltines in a shelter and counting her savings down to the penny. She finished her coffee. She stood up. She brushed off the back of her jeans. She went inside to eat breakfast with her daughter and with her friend in the building her grandmother had built for her. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.